Welcome back. Get comfortable. Pull your blanket up a little if you haven't already. Tonight we're going somewhere that feels like the tail end of summer. That particular shade of gold and shadow you only get in the Pacific Northwest, where the pine trees grow so tall they start to look like they're hiding something. Tonight we're going to Gravity Falls, Oregon. And we're going to stay a while. Section 1. Welcome to Gravity Falls. There is a town somewhere in the mountains of Oregon, fictional. Technically, but somehow more real than most places you've ever been. And if you ever drove through it without knowing what it was, you might think it was just another sleepy hamlet buried in the trees, a roadside attraction with a hand-painted sign. A diner that hasn't updated its menu since 1987. People who wave at strangers and mean it. But Gravity Falls is not that town. Gravity Falls is something else entirely. On June 15th, 2012, a Disney Channel animated series premiered that most people assumed was a lighthearted kids' adventure show. 12-year-old twins named Dipper and Mabel Pines got shipped off to spend the summer with their great-uncle in rural Oregon. There were monsters. There were mysteries. There was a gruff, lovable, scam-running uncle named Stan who ran a tourist trap called the Mystery Shack and filled it with fake exhibits about local weirdness that turned out to not be fake at all. That's what it looked like on the surface. What was actually happening was something that a man named Alex Hirsch had been planning for years, a layered, intricate, genuinely ambitious piece of storytelling that buried its most important truths so deep inside its own mythology that some of them are still being uncovered now, more than a decade after the final episode aired. Gravity Falls ran for 2 seasons, 40 episodes total. It ended on February 15th, 2016, and its finale became the most-watched telecast in the history of Disney XD at the time, which tells you something about how deeply people had fallen into it by the end. It spawned official tie-in books, including a physical version of the fictional Journal 3, complete with hidden messages that required a blacklight to read, a choose-your-own adventure novel containing what Hirsch called an enormous canon secret, and most recently, in July 2024, a book called The Book of Bill, written entirely from Bill Cipher's perspective, and laced with new ciphers, dark revelations, and lore expansions that reignited the fandom almost a decade after the show concluded. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning. The very beginning. The kind of beginning most people miss entirely. The town of Gravity Falls, Oregon, according to the show's internal mythology, sits in a valley that was carved millions of years ago by a spacecraft that crashed into the Earth. That's not a metaphor. In Season 2, Ford Pines takes Dipper to the edge of a cliff overlooking the hanging rock formations of the valley and holds up a keychain shaped like a little UFO. The cliffs are shaped the way they are because something fell out of the sky an unimaginable amount of time ago and left a scar in the ground. The crash leaked what Ford calls weirdness radiation into the surrounding environment. And over millions of years, that radiation saturated the land, the water, the trees, the air. It made Gravity Falls into a hotspot for paranormal activity, a place where the laws of nature bent a little differently than everywhere else. And that's why, when a young and brilliant researcher named Stanford Pines needed somewhere to study the unexplained, he chose Gravity Falls. He had a grant, a theory, and a notebook. He drove out to Oregon and looked at those twisted rock formations and those too dense forests, and that gray-green light filtering through the pines, and he knew he'd found the right place. That was 1981. By the summer of 2012, when Dipper and Mabel step off a bus and look up at the hand-painted Mystery Shack sign, everything that has happened in between those two moments has already set the stage for everything that's about to happen. The entire plot of Gravity Falls, every monster, every mystery, every confrontation, every sacrifice was already in motion before the twins arrived. They didn't start the story. They stepped into one that had been running for 30 years, one that was winding toward a conclusion whether they showed up or not. What makes Gravity Falls extraordinary isn't just that it's a good story. It's that it's a story that was designed from the very beginning to hide itself inside plain sight. The architecture of the show is intricate in a way that very few animated series or any series really have ever attempted. The foreshadowing is so deep and so specific that it staggers you when you go back and find it. The secrets hidden in the background of episodes feel almost aggressive in how precisely they were placed. And the encrypted messages that run through every single episode of the show's run tell a parallel story to the one happening on screen, one that takes longer to read and hits harder when you do. So tonight, we're going to go through all of it. We're going to take Gravity Falls apart layer by layer, the way you peel back the bark of a tree to find out what's been growing underneath. We'll start with the codes. If you're settling in right now, wherever you are in the world, drop a comment and let us know where and when you're watching. And if you want to keep this kind of content coming, a subscribe helps more than you know. It's completely free, and it means the world. Okay, let's go deeper. Section 2. The codes hidden in plain sight. There is a message hidden in the very first frame of the very first episode of Gravity Falls. Not hidden like Easter eggs are usually hidden, not tucked into a background detail or blinked across the screen so fast, you have to pause at exactly the right millisecond. It's right there, in the opening credits, visible every single episode for both seasons of the show's run. Most people who watched it never noticed it was there. Some people noticed it was there but didn't know what to do with it. And a small, obsessive, remarkable community of viewers cracked it within days of the premiere and immediately understood that they were dealing with a show that had no intention of revealing itself quietly. At the very end of the Gravity Falls opening theme, a sequence of letters flashes across the screen for a fraction of a second before cutting to the episode proper. The letters in the first episode read, VWDQ LVQRW ZKDW KH VH VHPV. If you apply a Caesar cipher to that, shifting each letter back by 3 positions in the alphabet, you get Stan is not what he seems. Think about that for a moment. From the very first episode, before you know anything about Stan's past, before you've heard a word about a portal in the basement, or a brother who disappeared, or an identity stolen and worn for 30 years like a second skin from the very beginning, the show is telling you. It put the answer in the credits and encoded it just enough that most people would scroll right past it. But it's there. It was always there. And then, if you reverse the audio of the opening theme during Season 1, underneath all that jaunty, slightly eerie background music, you can hear a whispered voice saying, 3 letters back. That's the key. Alex Hirsch hid the answer inside the question. He encoded a message and then hid the decoding key inside the show itself, in the one place you'd only find it if you were listening backwards. This is the level of intentionality we're dealing with. The cryptogram system in Gravity Falls is one of the most sophisticated things ever embedded in a children's animated series. It evolved over the course of the show's run in real time, rewarding viewers who were paying close enough attention to notice the shift. Episodes 1 through 6 use a Caesar cipher, shift every letter back by 3, and you get the hidden message. Nothing fancy, accessible enough that a curious 10-year-old with a pencil and a notebook could crack it. Then, at the very end of episode 6, in the cryptogram for that week, the message reads, Mr. Kazarian will be out next week. Mr. Atbash will substitute. The show was literally telling its audience that the cipher was changing. If you weren't paying attention, you'd miss it. If you were, you knew to come back with a new key. Episodes 7 through 13 use an Atbash cipher, where you mirror the alphabet. A becomes Z, B becomes Y, Z becomes A. Then, starting with episode 14, it shifts again to the A1Z26 cipher, where each letter is replaced by its numerical position in the alphabet. 1 equals A, 2 equals B, and so on through 26 for Z. The hint for this one is more subtle. A combined message across multiple earlier episodes, when decoded together, reads, From the first until the last, search the codes of credits past. 1 means 1, so search them all. Welcome to Gravity Falls. And then Season 2 arrives, and the show deploys its most complex weapon yet. The Visionaire Cipher. A Visionaire Cipher is a series of interlocking Caesar ciphers, where each individual letter's shift depends on a corresponding letter in a keyword. To decode it, you need to know the keyword. And where do you find the keyword? In the reversed audio of the new opening theme, where the whisper has changed again. This time it says, Key Visionaire. The keyword is gravity. When you apply that keyword to the Season 2 cryptograms, the messages that come out are no longer just jokes or teasers. They're darker, more personal. Some of them feel like confessions. The Season 2 credits cryptograms include things like 13 letters that are real. Gravity Falls is a place both you and I call home. And the combined message from multiple decoded cryptograms in Season 1 reads, "I was so blind. He lied to me. The darkness is near." That's Ford, writing in his journal about Bill Cipher, about the decades of manipulation he only understood in retrospect. The show was narrating its villain's most successful scheme through the closing credits, one letter at a time, across 2 seasons, in a code that required its audience to learn cryptography to crack. But the coded messages are just one layer of how Gravity Falls hid itself in plain sight. The visual Easter eggs go back just as far and reach just as deep. In the very first episode, as Dipper discovers Journal 3 among the tree roots of the forest, there are glowing eyes watching him from between the pines. Tiny, barely visible, nearly lost in the shadows of the background. Something was there the moment Dipper found that journal. Something had been waiting, and now it knew the journal had been discovered. If you know the show's mythology, if you've seen Weirdmageddon, if you understand who Bill Cipher is and what he's capable of, you know exactly whose eyes those were. Bill was present from the very first scene in the forest, not just observing, waiting. Throughout both seasons, the symbol of the Blind Eye Society appears in the background of episodes, long before the Society of the Blind Eye is ever mentioned. A crossed-out eye, like a cancellation symbol over something you're not supposed to see, it appears on walls, on signs, worked into the set dressing as if it's just part of the visual world. And it is, but it's also a clue to an organization that won't be named or explained until Season 2, Episode 7. Hirsch was seeding the visual vocabulary of that reveal more than a season before anyone watching would understand what they were looking at. Then there's the Bill Cipher wheel. In the opening credits, for just a flash, a circular diagram appears, a wheel covered in symbols, arranged around a central triangle with a single eye. A pine tree, a shooting star, a 6-fingered hand, a question mark, a llama, an ice pack, a pair of spectacles, a pentagram, a crescent, a heart, and in the middle, that eye. The wheel sits in the opening of the show from Episode 1. Most viewers register it as atmosphere, as set decoration, as the kind of occultish imagery that's just part of the show's visual style. But by the time the series finale arrives, they understand. That wheel was always a blueprint. Each symbol represents a specific person. The pine tree is Dipper, the shooting star is Mabel, the 6-fingered hand is Ford. The question mark is Seuss. The llama is Pacifica, who wore Mabel's llama sweater at the critical moment. The spectacles are McGucket. The bleeding heart is Robbie. The one-eyed star is Gideon. The crescent is Wendy. The heart is Stan. And the triangle in the middle is Bill. The wheel is a prophecy about how to defeat him. 10 people, each representing their symbol, standing together and joining hands to form a circuit powerful enough to trap a dimensional entity that's been awake since before the universe existed. It's all there in the opening credits from the very first episode, with the ending baked into the beginning, waiting for someone to understand what they were looking at. Alex Hirsch didn't just plan the story. He planned the experience of discovering the story. He designed Gravity Falls to reveal itself differently depending on how closely you were watching, and to reward the most obsessive viewers with information that the casual audience never even knew existed. And those rewards weren't trivial. They were genuine emotional content. They changed what the show meant. They transformed a fun adventure cartoon about twins and monsters into something that felt, if you found all the layers, closer to a mystery novel where the author had hidden chapters in the margins. Some of the cryptograms are funny inside jokes, winks at the audience, references to cutscenes or minor details, but some of them are devastating. The one that emerges when you decode the combined multi-episode cipher from Season 1, "I was so blind. He lied to me. The darkness is near." Is Ford writing in hindsight about the greatest mistake of his life, about the moment he invited something into his mind that would never fully leave it. And that's where we need to go next. To the man who wrote the journals. To the researcher who arrived in Gravity Falls in 1981 and changed everything. But first we need to understand where he came from. Section 3. The Mystery Shack and Stan's Secret Life. Pull the camera back from Gravity Falls for a moment. Zoom out past the pines, past the floating rock formations, Past the shack itself, with its hand-painted signs and its parking lot full of bewildered tourists. Zoom out all the way to a boardwalk on the coast of New Jersey, to a beach town called Glass Shard Beach, where the sand is less like sand and more like the suggestion of sand, coarse and unpleasant, and scattered with actual glass from years of broken bottles and washed-up debris. That's where Stan grew up. That's where the whole story actually begins. Stanley Pines was born on June 15th. In the late 1940s or early 1950s, the show is slightly imprecise about the exact year, but Stan is about 58 during the summer of 2012. He was born minutes after his twin brother Stanford. From the very beginning, the two of them were defined by their differences. Stanford, who everyone calls Ford, was the smart one. The one with the 6 fingers on each hand, a rare polydactyly that got him bullied and isolated, but also happened to be a mark of distinction in the eyes of their father, Philbrick Pines, a hard man who valued achievement above almost everything else. Ford was the prodigy. Ford was the one with the future. Stan was the other one, the charming one, the hustler, the one who ran scams on the beach and talked his way out of trouble and made people laugh. The one who was good at being a person, but less good at being the kind of person his father wanted him to be. But here's the thing about Stan and Ford. Before everything went wrong between them, they were best friends. Genuinely. Deeply. They had a boat they dreamed of sailing around the world. They had adventures together on those glass-sharp beaches. They had the kind of twin bond where you finish each other's sentences and you know what the other person is thinking before they've said anything. Where you can spend hours together in companionable silence and feel less alone than you do with anyone else in the world. They had all of that. And then Stan accidentally knocked Ford's science fair project off a table. It wasn't even a dramatic accident. It was the kind of thing that happens in a moment of carelessness, the kind of accident that in most families gets absorbed into a laugh and a shrug. But that science project was Ford's perpetual motion machine, his ticket to a full scholarship to West Coast Tech, the prestigious university that was going to be his launch pad into the world of serious scientific research. Ford had worked on it for months. It was the physical proof of his genius, and without it, the scholarship disappeared. Their father Philbrick's response was immediate and cold. He blamed Stan entirely. He decided that Stan was the anchor holding Ford back, that his presence in Ford's life was a liability. And so he threw Stan out, not sent to another school, not punished and forgiven, thrown out, given a suitcase and a car, and told not to come back until he'd made something of himself. Stan was 17 years old. He spent the next decade bouncing through failure after failure. He tried to start a business, multiple businesses actually, under the banner of something he called Stanco. None of them worked. He ran scams, he got banned from multiple states, he got imprisoned in at least 3 countries. He tried and failed and tried again and failed again, and all the while, somewhere in the back of his mind, the memory of his brother sat like a stone he couldn't put down. Ford, meanwhile, had gotten into a different university, Backups more, a much less prestigious institution whose most notable achievement, the journals note dryly, was clean dormitories. But Ford being Ford, he excelled there too. He earned his doctorate ahead of schedule. He met a brilliant mechanical engineer named Fiddleford Hadron McGucket, who would become his closest friend and collaborator. He won a grant worth $100,000, and he decided to spend that grant studying the supernatural phenomena of Gravity Falls, Oregon. The brothers barely spoke during these years. Ford's trajectory was upward and accelerating. Stan's was something else. It wasn't until Ford reached out, years later, with a desperate postcard asking Stan to come, just come. Don't ask questions, that the two of them were in the same room again. Stan arrived in Gravity Falls to find his twin brother barely holding together. Ford was brilliant and paranoid and increasingly isolated, convinced that something was wrong, that his great research project had been compromised in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He'd built an interdimensional portal in the basement of his house. He told Stan it was too dangerous. He asked Stan to take one of his journals and disappear. He was trying to protect the journals, keep them scattered, keep the information they contained out of whatever hands he feared were reaching for it. What happened next changed everything. The brothers fought. It was the old fight, really the one they'd been having in one form or another since the night the perpetual motion machine fell off the table. About worth and blame, and 30 years of silence and resentment that had been sitting between them like a wall neither of them had quite been willing to tear down. And in the middle of that fight, in the lab beneath the shack, Ford stumbled backward. And the portal took him. One moment he was there, the next moment he was gone. Sucked through an interdimensional gateway into parts of the universe that had no name and no map, and no way back without the machines he'd just left behind. Stan was alone. He'd shown up at his estranged brother's house, and in the space of 20 minutes, he'd lost him to another dimension. What Stan did next is one of the most extraordinary acts of love and stubbornness in the entire history of fiction. He didn't call the police. He didn't call anyone. He looked at the portal, and at the house around it, and at the journals that contained the information needed to rebuild and reactivate the machine, and he made a decision that would define the next 30 years of his life. He was going to get Ford back. Stan had Journal 1. Ford had taken Journal 2 with him into the portal. But Journal 3 was still somewhere in the house. Stan began to look. He found it eventually, hidden in the structure of the shack itself. But he was going to need time. And money. And a reason for people not to ask too many questions about what he was doing in a basement in the middle of rural Oregon. So he became Ford. Not metaphorically, literally. He took his brother's name, his identity, his social security number, his life. He staged a car crash to symbolically kill off the name Stanley Pines. He called himself Stanford Pines from that day forward. He converted the house into a tourist trap, the Mystery Shack, a demission $5, Gravity Falls' most baffling attraction, and he filled it with fake monster exhibits and invented local legends and charged people to look at rubber spiders with googly eyes. He did this for 30 years. Think about that number. 30 years of maintaining a false identity. 30 years of running a scam. Day after day. Season after season. Slowly and methodically rebuilding a machine he barely understood. In a basement beneath a tourist attraction. To rescue a brother who didn't even know he was being rescued. 30 years of not telling anyone. 30 years of laughing at his own terrible museum exhibits and fleecing tourists and wearing a name that wasn't his. Because doing all of that was the price of keeping the mission alive. When Dipper and Mabel arrive in the summer of 2012, Stan has been doing this for 3 decades. He is close, very close to having the portal operational again. He needs all 3 journals to activate it. He has 1 and 3. He needs 2. He spends most of the first season looking for it, without letting the twins know what he's actually doing or why. Every time Stan dismisses the supernatural, every time he pretends to be skeptical of the weird things happening around the shack, every time he deflects a direct question about what's really going on down in the basement, he's not just being a grumpy uncle. He's protecting a 30-year mission with everything he has, because he is terrified that if anyone finds out what's in that basement, the whole thing falls apart, Ford stays lost forever, and he has to live with the knowledge that his own carelessness, one knocked-over science project, 30-odd years ago, cost his brother his entire life. The cryptogram from the opening theme was right. Stan is not what he seems. But he's something far more remarkable than the simple deception implies. He is a man who spent 30 years being completely alone with a mission he couldn't tell anyone about, cheerfully scamming tourists to fund a machine he could barely operate, never giving up, never stopping. If there's a definition of love in Gravity Falls, it lives in the basement of the Mystery Shack, in that slowly rebuilding portal, in 30 years of one-sided devotion. That's the man Dipper and Mabel are sent to spend the summer with. That's Grunkle Stan. Section 4. Glass Shard Beach. The origin of everything. Let's go back to Glass Shard Beach, all the way back, before the portal and the journals and the 30 years of deception. Back to the beginning of the Pines family. Because you cannot understand what happens in Gravity Falls without understanding where these people came from. Philbrick Pines, the patriarch. A man described in the show's supplemental material as hard, pragmatic, and driven by a ferocious belief in achievement and upward mobility. He grew up working class and fought his way into a version of stability, and he wanted his sons to go further than he had. What he didn't understand or understand too well and responded to badly was that his 2 sons were fundamentally different kinds of people who were going to need fundamentally different kinds of support. Ford was the prodigy. From almost the first moment, it was apparent that Ford was exceptional, his intelligence tested off the charts. His interest in the unexplained was intense and focused from childhood, and his six-fingered hands, despite the bullying they attracted, became almost a symbol of his differentness in a broader sense. He was not quite like other people, and Philbrick saw in that differentness the raw material of greatness. Stan was funny and gregarious and charming and capable of talking his way into and out of almost any situation. But he was not Ford. And in the Pines household, not being Ford was a constant low-grade verdict. Stan never blamed his father in simple terms. The show is too smart for that kind of neat, emotional accounting. But the years of being the less favored twin left marks that showed up all over his adult life. The perpetual motion machine, the thing that started everything, sat in Ford's room for months. Stan had been in there 1,000 times. He knew what it was, knew how important it was, knew how much of Ford's future was riding on it. And on the night before the science fair that would determine whether Ford got his scholarship, in a moment of carelessness during what was probably just an ordinary conversation, something went wrong and the machine went off the table. The show doesn't make a villain of Stan for this. It makes it clear, through careful storytelling, that the accident was exactly that, an accident. But the consequences were not accidental. Ford's scholarship disappeared. Philbrick's verdict on Stan was delivered that same night, and the distance between the brothers, which had been zero, became everything. Here's something worth sitting with. The argument that eventually sends Ford through the portal, 30 years later, is in some ways the same argument as the night the machine fell. It is a conversation about blame and resentment, and the long shadow of one terrible accident. A conversation they never actually finished, because they kept getting interrupted by everything else. The portal takes Ford before they can resolve it. And so Stan carries not just the guilt of the accident, but the unfinished business of the argument for 30 more years. Ford, meanwhile, carries his own weight. He's never spoken it aloud, but there's something in the way he interacts with Stan. After returning from the portal, that combination of genuine gratitude and almost involuntary condescension that suggests the wound from that night never fully closed for him either. He loved Stan. He resented what happened. Both things were true at the same time for decades, and neither of them was ever quite able to let the other one fully in. What made the Pines brothers great also made them tragic, and Gravity Falls understands this with a precision that feels less like fiction and more like someone who knows exactly how families work when they love each other badly. But let's return to Glass Shard Beach and tell the story of what Ford did with his grant. Stanford Pines arrived at Backups University with anger and determination and no shortage of wounded pride, and he channeled all of it into work. He was brilliant before the scholarship fell through, and he became even more brilliant afterward. The kind of brilliant that happens when you have something to prove and all the time in the world to prove it. He completed his doctoral program 3 years ahead of schedule. While he was at Backups, he met Fiddleford Hadron McGucket, a young mechanical engineer from the South, who was passionate about personal computers and had a gentle, kind, slightly skittish energy that was a perfect counterbalance to Ford's intensity. The two became close friends, the kind of friends who work together and argue about ideas and push each other further than either would go alone. McGucket was brilliant in a different way than Ford, less theoretically daring, more mechanically gifted, the kind of engineer who could look at a schematic and immediately understand not just what it was designed to do, but how to make it do it better. Ford won a research grant worth $100,000 and used it to fund an investigation into the supernatural. He chose Gravity Falls, Oregon, because of evidence he'd gathered, suggesting it was a concentrated hotspot for anomalous activity, the kind of density of weirdness that made no rational sense, unless something was causing it, some underlying phenomenon he couldn't yet explain. He arrived in June of 1981. He got to work immediately, and within a remarkably short time, he began to understand that the weirdness of Gravity Falls went far deeper than even he had imagined. Ford documented everything. Every creature, every phenomenon, every impossible thing he encountered went into a journal. And as the pages of those journals accumulated, as the evidence built and the picture became clearer, Ford realized something that thrilled him and terrified him in equal measure. Gravity Falls wasn't just a strange place. It was a place where the boundary between dimensions was thin, a place where reality was negotiable, A place that had been drawing in researchers and dreamers and lost people since before living memory, because it was the closest thing to a doorway that the natural world had to offer. He built 3 journals, and then he hit a wall. The mystery of Gravity Falls, the underlying cause of all its strangeness, resisted his best explanations. He had the data. He had the catalog of phenomena. What he didn't have was the theory that connected everything. He was running out of explanations, running out of directions to look in. And in his frustration, he went deeper into the forest than he usually did. And he found a cave. Inside the cave were hieroglyphics, an inscription, an incantation. The inscription spoke of an entity of unending knowledge, something that could answer every question Ford had been unable to answer himself. Something that watched. Something that waited. And because Ford was who he was, brilliant and proud and too hungry for answers to be properly afraid of the thing he was reaching for, he read the incantation aloud. That was the mistake. That was the one you can't take back. Section 5. Ford arrives in Gravity Falls, the journals, and the anomalies. By 1981, the sleepy hamlet of Gravity Falls was already strange. But it was the quiet kind of strange, the kind that the residents had absorbed into their daily lives the way you absorb any persistent oddity. Gnomes in the forest, sure. Floating rocks, sure. The occasional encounter with something that didn't quite fit into any category. Something that blurred the line between creature and entity in ways that were hard to explain. People in Gravity Falls had developed a kind of studied inattention to the unusual, a communal agreement not to look too closely at the things that didn't make sense. Into this town, in the summer of 1981, came a man with a briefcase and a notebook and 6 fingers on each hand. Ford had done his preliminary research before arriving. He knew, in broad strokes, that Gravity Falls sat in a valley with unusual geological properties. Those hanging rock formations, those cliffs, shaped like the aftermath of something massive coming down from above. He had documented reports of supernatural sightings going back decades. He had the $100,000 grant and the theoretical framework and the pure, undiluted enthusiasm of someone who has found the place that was always waiting for them. He arrived in June of 1981 and began documenting immediately. Journal 1 came first, the foundational text, the one that established Ford's voice and his methodology. He was exhaustive, precise, almost obsessively thorough. He drew diagrams and included measurements and cross-reference sightings. The journal entry format he used became a kind of signature numbered entries, sketches in the margins, personal notes that leaked through the scientific detachment when something genuinely surprised or frightened him. He documented the gnomes, small, bearded creatures living in organized colonies in the forest, obsessive about certain human behaviors, capable of organizing themselves into larger forms when threatened or excited. He documented the ghosts, the portals, the creatures that couldn't be classified into anything that biology had a word for. He documented the town's founding, and in doing so discovered that the official history of Gravity Falls was a lie, that the credited founder, Nathaniel Northwest, had in fact been installed as a figurehead by the United States government to conceal the town's true founder, a man named Sir Lord Quentin Tremblay III, the 85th President of the United States, who had fallen off a cliff and then proceeded to found an entire town before preserving himself in peanut brittle for future generations. The kinds of things you find when you really start looking. Ford's first journal was a marvel of observation and documentation. The second went deeper. By the time Ford was working on Journal 2, he had been in Gravity Falls for several years, and the shape of its mysteries had become clearer and darker simultaneously. He had moved beyond cataloging individual phenomena and into trying to understand the underlying structure, the why and the how, the thing beneath the thing, the force or forces that made Gravity Falls the way it was. And it was in this period that he hit the wall, the explanatory gap, the place where even the best data ran out and left him standing in the dark. Ford was not a man who handled unanswered questions well. His entire identity was built on the premise that intelligence and effort and sufficient rigor could unlock any door. The moment he encountered a mystery that genuinely exceeded his current toolkit, he didn't step back. He pressed forward. He went farther into the forest than was sensible. He looked at inscriptions that no rational person should have read aloud. Journal 3 was almost complete when he found the cave. Almost complete, but lacking the central theory that would have made all the individual entries cohere into a unified explanation. Ford was so close to his grand unified theory of weirdness that he could feel its shape. He just couldn't see it clearly. The cave offered him a path forward. The incantation described something an entity of infinite knowledge. A being who had seen everything and knew the answers to questions that mortal minds couldn't formulate. And Ford, standing in a cave in the Oregon forest with the echo of his own voice dying away, waited to see what he'd called. What came was Bill Cipher, the creature who would eventually destroy Gravity Falls, transform the sky into a nightmare, build a throne from the frozen bodies of the townspeople, and come within a single mistake of unraveling reality itself. That creature entered Stanford Pine's mindscape for the first time in a cave in 1981 and presented itself as a muse. A friendly one, a charming one, a helpful one. That's important. Bill Cipher, in his first appearance to Ford, was not frightening. He was dazzling. He arrived in the mindscape as a warm, yellow, triangular presence, bright and expansive, and he introduced himself with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting a very long time for an interesting conversation, and is genuinely excited to be having one at last. He told Ford that he appeared to one genius per century, that Ford was the one, that he could offer knowledge in exchange for the ability to move freely within Ford's mind. Ford said yes. Section 6. The deal with the triangle. Bill Cipher's true nature. To understand Bill Cipher, you have to understand where he came from. And to understand where he came from, you have to go back much, much further than the caves of Oregon. You have to go back to a place that doesn't exist anymore. Bill Cipher is over 1 trillion years old. He states this himself at various points during the series, with the particular casual arrogance of someone for whom 1 trillion years is roughly equivalent to a childhood. He is described as something like a preteen by the standards of his home dimension. The age alone should tell you something about the scale of what Ford was inviting into his mind when he read that incantation. But the age is just the beginning of it. Bill originated from a two-dimensional universe known as Euclidia, sometimes called the second dimension. A flat world, by every account Bill has ever given of it, populated by flat minds with flat dreams. He has called it boring. He has called it stifling. He has described the society of Euclidia as oppressive and rigid, governed by forces he despised, and his accounts of his early existence there are shot through with the particular contempt of someone who was always too large for the container they were born into. The Book of Bill, released in 2024 and written entirely in Bill's voice, expands on the story of Euclidia in ways that are both clarifying and genuinely disturbing. Bill's accounts of his home world are unreliable by his own admission. He is, by every metric that exists, a congenital liar, and his self-narrated backstory should be treated with the same skepticism you'd apply to any account given by someone who literally introduced himself as a con man. But certain elements of the Euclidia story have been corroborated by other sources, by the axolotl poem, by Ford's journal, by architectural details of the mythology that fit together in ways that couldn't have been accidental. What we know for certain, Euclidia is gone, it was destroyed, and Bill destroyed it. The manner of that destruction is where the accounts get complicated. Bill, in his own narration, describes what happened in Euclidia as a kind of liberation. He introduced the concept of a third dimension to a two-dimensional world, showed the flat beings of his home universe what existed beyond their plane of existence. And the result was catastrophic. The Euclidean massacre, it's called in the wider multiverse mythology, a catastrophe of universal proportions that annihilated an entire plane of existence. But here's what the Book of Bill suggests, in its more honest moments. It was an accident. The destruction of Euclidia was not a deliberate act of conquest. It was the result of someone who didn't fully understand the consequences of what they were doing or understood them, and couldn't stop once they'd started showing his homeworld something it couldn't survive seeing. The axolotl's poem about Bill includes the line, "Saw his own dimension burn, misses home and can't return." And elsewhere in the Book of Bill, in moments where Bill's mask slips just slightly, you can see grief underneath the bravado. The last remaining atoms of Euclidia are described as being kept inside Bill's top hat, which tells you something about the relationship between a man and the place he destroyed. Bill snapped from the guilt, apparently. Convinced himself, or tried to convince himself, that the destruction was intentional, that he had liberated Euclidia, that the flat minds and their flat dreams had been elevated, not annihilated. He built an entire mythology around the idea that what he'd done to his home world was a gift, because the alternative, accepting that he'd committed a massacre that destroyed everyone he ever knew, was not something he was willing to sit with. After Euclidia's destruction, Bill was left alone in the nightmare realm, a space between dimensions where the laws of physics are not consistent, and reality is more of a suggestion than a fact. He had enormous power, but no physical form in the dimension where physical things existed. He could enter minds. He could make deals. He could influence events from within the mindscape, the shared mental space that overlaps with the physical world. But he couldn't touch anything. Couldn't build anything. Was locked outside the world he wanted to reshape. For 1,000,000,000,000 years, or whatever fraction of that the relevant section covers, Bill had been working on solving that problem. He'd been reaching into the minds of humans, particularly in and around the area that would become Gravity Falls, because the unusual dimensional properties of that valley made it the closest thing to a door that the physical world had to offer. He'd been making deals, collecting information, and patiently waiting for someone brilliant enough to help him build what he needed. A portal between the nightmare realm and the physical world that would let him through. Ford Pines was that someone. Bill presented himself to Ford as a muse, as mentioned. He offered knowledge in exchange for access to Ford's mind. And Ford, brilliant, isolated, hungry for answers, and perhaps not as careful about the things that excited him as he should have been, agreed. For years, Bill fed Ford the information and the insights that allowed his research to proceed. The interdimensional portal was Ford's idea, technically, but the key conceptual breakthroughs that made it possible came from Bill. The deal was, in every meaningful sense, a con. But Ford didn't know that yet. He knew something was wrong before he knew what it was. Fiddleford McGucket, who Ford had brought in to help with the technical aspects of the portal construction, had an encounter while testing the machine that left him irreversibly changed. He looked through the aperture of the portal and saw something on the other side, something in the nightmare realm that was waiting, and the sight of it broke him in ways that couldn't be repaired. He quit. He begged Ford to quit. He told Ford that whatever was on the other side of that portal was not something that should be let through. Ford didn't stop. He was too close. He was too invested. The years of work, the relationship with Bill, the intellectual intoxication of having a research partner who could answer every question, all of it had become walls around his judgment, and McGucket's terror wasn't enough to breach them. The portal neared completion. Then something happened that sent Ford back through his journals, back through the history of his partnership with Bill, looking at the evidence with new eyes. Something made him understand too late, but not entirely too late, what had been happening. Bill was not a muse. Bill was not a friend. Bill was a being who had been running a long con for longer than civilization had existed, and Ford had been the mark. Ford tried to shut down the portal. He tried to destroy the journals, or at least scatter them, put them somewhere Bill couldn't access them. He reached out to Stan in desperation. And then Stan arrived and they had the argument that changed everything, and Ford fell through the portal and Stan was alone. And Bill had to wait a little longer. Section 7. Fiddleford McGucket. The saddest story in Gravity Falls. There is an old man in Gravity Falls who lives in a junkyard. He wears overalls and a battered hat, and he mutters to himself about things that don't make sense, and he eats things that aren't food, and the children in town are afraid of him, in the way children are afraid of anything they can't explain. He builds elaborate mechanical contraptions out of garbage. He makes noise, late at night. He has been this way, the townspeople will tell you, for as long as anyone can remember, which is to say, for as long as the town has been paying attention, which is to say, since before any of the current residents were paying attention to him. His name is Fiddleford Hadron McGucket. He was once, by any reasonable measure, one of the most brilliant mechanical engineers of his generation. The distance between those two facts is the darkest story in Gravity Falls. Fiddleford McGucket grew up in the American South, with the particular combination of folksy warmth and incisive mechanical intelligence that made him stand out from a very early age. He arrived at Backups University with a passion for personal computers. This was in the mid-1970s, when personal computer was still more of a dream than a product, and immediately made an impression on the handful of people who were smart enough to understand what he was working on. One of those people was Ford Pines. Their friendship was genuine. Ford's recollection of McGucket in the journals is warm and specific in ways that his descriptions of other people rarely are. McGucket as a young but brilliant mechanic. McGucket as someone with a perspective that complemented rather than duplicated Ford's own. McGucket as a friend who mattered. When Ford was awarded his grant and started planning his expedition to Gravity Falls, it was McGucket he thought of first. He needed someone who could turn theoretical schematics into working machines. McGucket was the best person he knew for that. McGucket moved to Palo Alto initially, set up a personal computer business he called Fiddleford Computer Majigs, and was on his way to something that could have been remarkable. Then Ford called, and because McGucket was loyal and curious and believed in what Ford was trying to do, he came to Gravity Falls to help. For a while, everything was fine. They worked. The research progressed. McGucket's mechanical genius turned Ford's theoretical frameworks into working devices, the portal most significantly. But also, the memory erasing gun and various other pieces of technology that showed up throughout the shack's history. The collaboration was exactly what Ford had hoped it would be. Then came the test run. McGucket was there when they first powered up the portal and opened the aperture. He was standing close enough to see through it, into whatever lay on the other side of the threshold between this dimension and the nightmare realm. And what he saw the show is deliberately, almost cruelly vague about the exact content of that vision broke something fundamental in his mind. He stumbled backward. He couldn't describe it. He didn't have words for it, in the way that you sometimes don't have words for things that are not meant to exist within the categories your mind has developed to process reality. He told Ford they had to stop. He told Ford that what was on the other side of that portal was not something that should be allowed through. He begged, with the particular desperation of someone who has just seen something that cannot be unseen. Ford didn't stop. And McGucket, unable to live with what he'd seen and unable to get Ford to close the portal, made a device. The memory gun. He built it himself, with his own hands, out of the same mechanical genius that had built everything else. He designed it to extract specific memories from the human mind, to remove them cleanly, encapsulate them, and leave a gap where they'd been. He used it on himself. And it worked. The memory of the thing through the portal was gone. He could breathe again, he could sleep. So he used it again. And then again. And then again. Every time something happened that he couldn't process, every encounter with the supernatural, every glimpse of something that pushed up against the edges of his comprehension, he reached for the memory gun. At first it was targeted. He knew what he was erasing. He took out the bad things carefully, like a surgeon removing a specific piece of tissue. But the brain is not that precise, and the gun was not that precise. And the more he used it, the more collateral damage accumulated. Connections broke. Context vanished. He started erasing things that weren't supposed to be erased. Things that were structurally important to the coherent narrative of who he was. By 1982, approximately a year after the portal had first been opened and disaster had already occurred, Fiddleford McGucket founded the Society of the Blind Eye. His original intention was charitable. In a particular kind of broken way, he had found relief from his own memories, and he wanted to offer that same relief to others. There were people in Gravity Falls who had seen things they couldn't process, been touched by the supernatural in ways that left them sleepless and frightened. McGucket wanted to give them what he'd given himself, the ability not to know. He founded the society to help people forget the things that were hurting them. By the time Dipper and Mabel discovered the society in Season 2, McGucket himself hasn't been lucid for decades. He has used the memory gun on himself so many times that the damage is essentially total. He doesn't remember the society. He doesn't remember Ford. He doesn't remember the portal, or the thing he saw through it, or the 2 years he spent helping build the machine that nearly destroyed the world. He doesn't remember being brilliant. He doesn't remember being young. He doesn't remember Gravity Falls before 1982, which is the year he effectively stopped being the person he'd been. What he remembers, when he remembers anything, are fragments, impressions, the shape of things without the content. In Season 2, Episode 7, Society of the Blind Eye, Dipper and Mabel help him recover some of what was taken from him. They find the Hall of the Forgotten, the room beneath the Gravity Falls Museum of History, where the society stored all the memories they'd extracted from the townspeople, each one sealed in a glass tube and filed away. McGucket's memories are there. He gets some of them back. And what he remembers, when the memories return, is devastating. He remembers helping build the portal. He remembers seeing what was on the other side. He remembers the moment he understood that Ford wasn't going to stop no matter what McGucket said or did, and the feeling of being completely alone was something unspeakable. He remembers making the memory gun and using it for the first time. And he remembers that even then, even in that first moment of relief, he knew on some level that he was doing something he wouldn't be able to undo. "My name is Fiddleford Hadron McGucket," he says in his recovered memory, "and I wish to unsee what I have seen." This is the phrase that comes before everything else. The wish that started the machine. The wish that cost him 30 years of his life. By the time Dipper and Mabel encounter him, McGucket is starting to recover. The memory gun has done all the damage it can do to him, as Blind Ivan discovers when he tries to erase McGucket's memories during their confrontation. There's nothing left to erase. The mind that was there before is gone, but something new has grown in the space the erasure left behind. He is strange and disjointed and frequently incomprehensible. But he is also capable of kindness and loyalty and moments of mechanical brilliance that suggest the original McGucket is still in there somewhere, buried under the scar tissue. By the series finale, he has largely recovered his sense of self. He sells his patents to the government and becomes wealthy. He moves into Northwest Manor, which has been lost to bankruptcy by the Northwest family in the aftermath of Weirdmageddon. He runs a place called McGucket's Hootenanny Hut. He is, at the end of it all, okay. But the distance from where he started to where he ended up is still enormous. And the saddest thing about Fiddleford McGucket isn't what happened to him. It's that he did it to himself. He made the gun. He pulled the trigger. He thought he was solving a problem. And what he was actually doing was erasing himself. There's something in that story that feels true in a way that extends well beyond Gravity Falls. The instinct to remove what you can't process, rather than find a way to live with it, is not unique to magical memory erasing devices. It's a profoundly human impulse. And Gravity Falls shows you where it goes if you follow it far enough. A man in a junkyard who can't remember his own name, building machines out of garbage, alone. Section 8. The Society of the Blind Eye. 30 years of forced forgetting. Beneath the Gravity Falls Museum of History, there is a room full of glass tubes. Each tube contains a memory. Each memory belongs to someone who lives in town, someone who went for a walk one night and saw something they couldn't explain, or looked out their window at the wrong moment, or found something in the woods that didn't belong in any category their mind had been trained to hold. The tubes are labeled with names. They're organized with the particular bureaucratic precision of an organization that has been running for a long time and has developed systems. This is the Hall of the Forgotten. This is the archive of everything that Gravity Falls has chosen not to know. The Society of the Blind Eye was founded by Fiddleford McGucket in 1982, approximately a year after he first encountered the horror on the other side of Ford's portal. His original vision for it was, in the most charitable reading, a kind of mercy organization, a group that used the memory gun to provide relief to people who had encountered the supernatural and been traumatized by what they'd seen. He genuinely believed, at the beginning, that he was offering something valuable, that the ability to forget was a gift. He was wrong about that, but not in a simple way. The story of the Blind Eye Society is a story about how good intentions curdle when they're organized, institutionalized, and eventually handed off to people who don't share the original vision. McGucket ran the society while he still had enough of his own mind intact to run it. He used the memory gun. He took in the frightened and the traumatized, removed what they couldn't carry, and sent them back into the world unburdened. He probably felt virtuous about it in the early stages. But he was also using the gun on himself throughout this period, which means his judgment was degrading at the same time he was building the institution. By the time his mind had deteriorated enough that he couldn't effectively lead the society, it had developed its own momentum, its own culture, its own sense of mission. And the mission had shifted. The original mission was, help people who want to forget. The new mission was, keep Gravity Falls ignorant of its own supernatural nature. The original mission was about consent and relief. The new mission was about control. Blind Ivan, the society's leader by the time Dipper and Mabel discover it in Season 2, is not McGucket. He doesn't have McGucket's original sorrow or his original intention. He is a man who believes, with a genuine and slightly chilling certainty, that the residents of Gravity Falls are better off not knowing what their town actually is. He has appointed himself and the society as the guardians of that ignorance, and he has gone about his work with a thoroughness that borders on fanatical. The members of the society turn out to be ordinary townspeople, not monsters, not extraordinary, in any particularly dark way. Toby determined the journalist. Bud gleeful. Gideon's father. The guy who married a woodpecker at Pioneer Day. The show is specific about this last one, which tells you something about the texture of Gravity Falls community. These are people who at some point encountered the supernatural and chose the society's solution, and who have then become agents of that same erasure for others. The episode in which Dipper, Mabel, Suze, and Wendy discover the society with McGucket's help, after finding his name on the fragments of a memory they'd recovered, is one of Season 2's best. It begins with the mundane horror of watching lazy Susan get dragged away in the night after accidentally seeing the gnomes steal a pie, and it ends with something genuinely thoughtful about why people choose not to know things. The show never makes the Blind Eye Society purely villainous. They're misguided, increasingly corrupt, and by the end they're operating in ways McGucket never intended, using the gun to suppress dissent within their own ranks as much as to help the genuinely traumatized. When one society member expresses concern about the organization's methods, Blind Ivan uses the memory gun to erase the objection itself. That's the institutional rot in miniature. The mechanism designed to provide mercy has become a mechanism for self-preservation. But the original impulse was understandable. There is something real in the question the society exists to answer. What do you do with knowledge you can't process? What do you do when reality offers you something your mind isn't equipped to hold? The answer the society chose was erasure. The show suggests, without being preachy about it, that this is the wrong answer, but it doesn't pretend the question is simple. When Dipper defeats the society and uses the memory gun to erase the members' own knowledge of their involvement, there's a moment of almost symmetry. The tool they used against others is used against them. The irony is pointed but not triumphant. These are just people who made a particular kind of choice about knowledge and power, and who ended up far from where they started. The most notable casualty is Blind Ivan himself, who suffers permanent damage from the reversal of his memories. He is left in a state similar to McGucket's, without the context that made his life coherent, without the connections that held everything together. He had no life outside the society, and once the society was gone from his memory, he had very little. The cross-hatched eye, symbol the blind eye's mark, crossed-out sight, appears in the background of the show from early in the first season. It's on walls in the background, worked into set dressing, present in scenes that have nothing to do with the society. Hirsch was planting the visual vocabulary of the reveal long before the reveal arrived. Every time that symbol appeared, it was a marker of the society's presence, evidence that they had been there, had seen what needed to be suppressed, and had acted accordingly. The town of Gravity Falls has been curated, in a sense, by the Blind Eye Society. What the townspeople know and don't know about their home has been actively managed for 30 years. The strange things that happen get erased from individual memories while continuing to exist in the world. The supernatural is real, but is systematically prevented from becoming socially acknowledged. It creates a town that is simultaneously saturated with weirdness and collectively committed to not quite seeing it, until Dipper and Mabel arrive and start looking closely. Section 9. Stan's vigil 30 years alone with a machine. Let's go back to the basement. After Ford disappears through the portal, after the shock settles into the cold, hard reality of what has happened, Stan stands alone in a room full of machines he barely understands, in a house that belonged to his brother, in a town he arrived at 2 hours ago. He has Journal 1. He knows there are 3 journals, and that all 3 are needed to operate the portal. He knows his brother is on the other side of a dimensional gateway, and that reopening it is the only way to bring him back. He knows that if he walks away, Ford is gone forever. So he doesn't walk away. This is important to really feel, because it's so easy to skim past it. Stan Pine's the con artist, the scammer, the guy who ran Stanco into the ground and got banned from multiple states and spent time in 3 different countries' jails, chose, in that moment, to commit himself to a decades-long project of devotion. He chose it completely, without fanfare, without anyone to tell him he was making the right choice. He chose it knowing it might not work, knowing that he would have to lie to everyone, knowing that the cost would be 30 years of his life and his actual identity. He chose it because it was Ford. Stan has never been good at saying out loud how much the people he loves mean to him. The whole second season of the show is largely about that gap between Stan's feelings and his ability to express them, and how that gap has cost him almost everything at various points in his life. But in the basement of the Mystery Shack, without an audience and without any guarantee of success, he demonstrated exactly how much he felt by what he was willing to give. He took Ford's name. Stanford Pines. He became the owner of this house, the researcher, the man with the academic credentials. He staged a car crash, literally faked his own death, as Stanley, and ceased to exist on paper. The person named Stanley Pines died in a car accident. The person named Stanford Pines opened a tourist attraction in Gravity Falls, Oregon. The Mystery Shack began as a financial necessity. Stan needed money to keep the lights on and the mission running, and the weirdness of Gravity Falls made it easy enough to put up some fake exhibits and charge tourists to look at them. He leaned into the gimmick with the particular flair of someone who's been running scams his whole life and knows exactly how to calibrate what people are willing to believe. The world's most diabolical dirtknob. Authentic Sasquatch foot. Enter if you dare. He was good at it. Because he'd been good at similar things his whole life, and because the performative buffoonery of the Shack's attractions was an excellent cover for the fact that the man running them was engaged in something quite serious in the basement below. For 30 years, Stan worked on the portal. He worked around it, with it, in spite of it. He tried to understand Ford's schematics well enough to make progress. He hit walls and worked around them. He sourced parts from wherever he could get them, some legitimately, some less so. He hired Seuss, eventually Jesus Ramirez, the handyman who became the Shack's most essential employee and the closest thing Stan had to family during those decades. And Wendy later, as a cashier. Neither of them knew what was in the basement. Neither of them was meant to. The twins, when they arrived, changed the equation. Dipper found journal 3 inches the woods hidden in a mechanical arm attached to a tree, behind a panel, exactly where Ford had left it before the fight that sent him through the portal. And the moment Dipper found it, the pace of Stan's work accelerated. Because the journal contained information Stan had been lacking. He needed that journal. He'd been working without it for 30 years. When Dipper brought it back to the shack, when Stan held all the pieces he needed for the first time in 3 decades, the end became visible for the first time. He didn't tell the twins. He let them use the journal to fight monsters and solve mysteries. Let them think that was what the journal was for, while secretly using the information in it to complete the reconstruction of the portal. He manipulated them, in a sense. He was doing what he'd always done, protecting the mission by not letting anyone see the whole picture. But here's the counterpoint, and the show is careful about this. Stan genuinely came to love Dipper and Mabel during that summer. The beginning of the season is full of Stan using the twins as labor, running small scams involving them, treating them more like convenient assets than people he actually cared about. But something shifts. The fishing trip where Stan made them matching hats. The episode where it turns out Stan had a boat named the Stan O' War, an echo of the childhood dream he and Ford shared. The accumulating weight of evidence that beneath the gruff exterior and the petty frauds, Stan was a person who wanted family and struggled, his whole life, to let himself have it. By the time the portal is about to activate, by the time the government agents have arrived, and the truth about the basement is about to come out, Stan is faced with a choice. The portal needs all 3 journals to activate, and the activation might kill everyone in the shack. Mabel has to decide whether to trust Stan to pull the lever that activates the portal without knowing anything about why. Without proof, without safety guarantees. She does it. She trusts him, completely, in the most dangerous moment of that summer. And Ford comes through. 30 years. One brother alone in a basement with machines he barely understood and a mission he never once considered abandoning. And then the portal opens and Ford steps through, and Stan sees his twin for the first time in 30 years. And whatever it costs the government agents, the exposure, the fact that everything is about to become significantly more complicated, it was worth it. Every single day of it was worth it. That is Stan Pines. Scam artist, great uncle, 30-year devotee of the most extraordinary act of love in the show's history. Not what he seems. Not in the way you expected. Section 10. The journals and what lives in their pages. 3 notebooks. That's what you're holding, if you're Ford Pines. Standing in the Oregon forest in 1981 with your $100,000 grant and your certainty that somewhere in this strange, beautiful, wrong-feeling town lies the answer to a question you haven't even properly formulated yet. 3 notebooks, and you're about to fill them with the most extraordinary research anyone has ever done in the field of paranormal phenomena. You don't know that yet. You think you're just starting. You think the hard part hasn't arrived yet. You have no idea. The journals are foundational to Gravity Falls in a way that's worth dwelling on. They're not just props or plot devices. They're the material evidence that Ford was here, that he did this work, that everything the show reveals about the town's history and strangeness was documented by one person over years of careful, sometimes terrifying research. When Dipper opens Journal 3 Inches the Forest and reads Ford's voice for the first time, careful, precise, occasionally wry, and underneath it all, genuinely frightened by what he's found, he is opening a direct line to someone who came before and looked at the same things and wrote them down so that someone else might have a chance of surviving them. Journal 1 covers the early phase of Ford's research, the broad catalog, the foundational documentation of Gravity Falls' weirdness. It includes entries on gnomes, which Ford observed and documented with the careful neutrality of a field researcher. Gnomes in Gravity Falls are not the garden ornament variety. They are small, organized, possessed of a patriarchal social structure that involves repeated and unsuccessful attempts to kidnap and marry human women, and they are capable of merging into a large, single gnome shape when sufficiently motivated. The first episode of the series involves Dipper saving Mabel from a gnome who was attempting exactly this kind of arranged supernatural marriage. Ford had cataloged them years before, without Dipper's rescue element but with more detail about their organizational behavior. Journal 1 also includes material on ghosts. Gravity Falls has a significant spectral population, ranging from the relatively harmless to the genuinely dangerous. Wax figures that come to life and murder people they feel have been insulted by. The ghost of a lumberjack who had been dead for 150 years and was owed a debt that hadn't been paid. Ford's ghost entries are some of the more dry-humored sections of the journal, written in the particular deadpan of a researcher who has grown accustomed to things being strange and has found a kind of comfort in cataloging them precisely. Journal 2, which Ford carried with him through the portal, is the journal that Gideon Gleeful Gravity Falls' most unnerving child prodigy, an amateur malevolent force, had in his possession during the events of Season 1. Gideon had found it somewhere, had decoded enough of its contents to understand that it described real power, real mechanisms of control, real tools for doing the things that an ambitious and deeply unpleasant 12-year-old might want to do. His possession of Journal 2 is the first indication in the show that the journals are not safe, that the wrong person having one of them represents a genuine danger. Journal 3 is the one Dipper finds. It's the most personal of the 3. Ford was writing it after years in Gravity Falls, and by that point his voice in the journal had become less formally scientific and more personal, more urgent. The entries in Journal 3 include not just facts and observations, but warnings. Warnings about Bill Cipher, about what he is and what he wants, written in a hand that grows shakier and more urgent as the journal progresses. By the end of the entries Ford made before disappearing, the text is barely legible. He was in a hurry. He was scared. He knew something was closing in. The physical Journal 3, released by Disney in 2016, expanded enormously on the show's lore. It included annotations by multiple characters. Stan's cramped, defensive handwriting appears in margins, responding to Ford's entries decades later. Dipper and Mabel add their own notes. Bill Cipher, impossibly, has annotated sections of the journal too, appearing in the margins with his own cipher-encoded commentary, taunting and revelatory in equal measure. The physical journal treats its existence as a legitimate, in-universe document, something that multiple people have passed through their hands and marked with their own presences. It also contains material that the show only hinted at. Ford's time in other dimensions, after the portal, the 30 years he spent navigating the multiverse alone, is referenced in the journal in ways that give texture to how extraordinary and how lonely that period was. He encountered civilizations. He developed survival skills that no human being had ever needed before. He built devices that made things possible which had previously been impossible. And through all of it, he was trying to find a way home, to find the path back to the dimension he'd come from, to get back to the portal. He succeeded, eventually. He was returned to Gravity Falls by the reactivation of the portal by Stan's 30 years of patient, devoted work. And when he stepped through and found himself in a world that had moved on without him, found his brother and his family, and a town that had changed in ways both small and enormous, he had to reckon with everything that had happened on both sides of the portal during his absence. The journals hold all of it. Every creature Ford documented, every mystery he cataloged, every warning he wrote in those increasingly urgent final pages. They're the original act of looking closely at Gravity Falls and deciding not to look away. Dipper inherits them from Ford in the most literal sense. He uses Journal 3 as his primary tool throughout the show, and the relationship between the boy and the book is one of the show's quieter emotional threads. Dipper was someone who was always going to find that journal. The journal was always going to be found by someone like Dipper. The moment in the forest where he reaches into the mechanical arm in the tree, and his hand closes around the spine of that book, that moment was always going to happen. It was just a matter of when. Section 11. Dipper and Mabel arrive the summer that changes everything. It is the first day of June, 2012, and two 12-year-olds are sitting on a bus that smells like exhaust and old upholstery, somewhere in the green-shadowed roads of Oregon, watching the trees get thicker and stranger as the miles accumulate. Mabel Pines, on the right side of the aisle, has a sweater covered in pictures of cats and is already working on a new friendship bracelet, even though the bus isn't yet close to its destination. She has packed 17 sweaters, a pet hamster ball, a grappling hook, and enough optimism to fuel a small city. She is the most fully realized version of a person who has decided, on a fundamental level, that enthusiasm is both a strategy and an identity, and the world has not yet given her a compelling reason to reconsider. Dipper Pines, on the left, has a baseball cap pulled low and a notebook already open, and is looking out the window at the weird rock formations, with the particular intensity of someone who is going to remember every detail of this approach. He has been anxious since they were told they were being sent to stay with their great-uncle for the summer, not because he's afraid, exactly, but because he doesn't quite know what to expect, and he is not someone who handles the unknown gracefully. He is the kind of person who deals with uncertainty by gathering information, and there isn't any information available right now, and that bothers him. Their parents, children of Stan's brother Shermie, it's eventually revealed, decided the twins could use some fresh air. Some time away from Piedmont, California, away from the familiar rhythms of their regular lives. A summer adventure with a relative they barely know, in a place they've never been. The mystery shack appears around a bend in the road, the way things appear in dreams suddenly, fully formed, as if it's always been there, and you were just not yet in the right position to see it. The hand-painted sign, the parking lot, the shape of the building, which is either pleasingly eccentric or deeply worrying depending on your disposition. Stan is there in his fez and his vest, looking at them with the practiced assessment of someone who has been sizing people up his whole life and has gotten very good at it. "You've been here 10 seconds, and you're already my favorite relative," he tells Mabel, almost immediately. There's truth in that joke. The early episodes of Gravity Falls have a quality that's easy to underestimate, because they seem to be operating purely in the register of fun adventure show. Monster of the Week, Mystery of the Week, Twins, plus the Mystery Shack, plus the town. All of it brightly colored and funny, and moving at the particular speed of good children's entertainment. What's actually happening in those early episodes, structurally, is the establishment of everything that will matter later. Every character introduced in the first few episodes will have a role in the finale. Every mystery introduced will have a resolution. Every relationship dynamic established early will be tested before the end. The gnomes in the first episode are genuinely bizarre and genuinely funny small-bearded creatures who communicate in swarms, who have an elaborate social structure built around collective motion, who tried to kidnap Mabel as part of a bride acquisition scheme. But they also represent something about the show's approach to the supernatural. Nothing in Gravity Falls is purely comedic, without also being at least a little unsettling, and nothing is purely unsettling without at least some comedy to leaven it. The gnomes are hilarious and kind of horrifying at the same time. And that tonal balance is what Gravity Falls maintains with remarkable consistency across 40 episodes. Dipper's arc begins with the discovery of Journal 3, which he treats from the beginning not just as a tool but as a relationship. He reads Ford's voice in those pages, and something connects the careful attention, the insistence on finding the truth even when it's frightening, the sense that the world is stranger and more extraordinary than the people around you are willing to acknowledge. Ford wrote in the journal with all the lonely certainty of someone who knows what they've found and doesn't have anyone around who believes them. Dipper reads with the recognition of someone who knows that feeling intimately. Mabel's arc begins with the heart of her character. She is relentlessly, almost aggressively social, the kind of person who makes friends with everyone and approaches every situation assuming that connection is possible. Her summer romance plotline, the series of crushes that don't work out, the repeated experience of reaching for connection and having it slip away through circumstance or misunderstanding, is often played for comedy. But there's something underneath it that matters. Mabel is someone who believes in the possibility of love with a fervor that sometimes leads her into bad situations, and the show treats that belief as a genuine thing rather than a flaw to be corrected. She's not naive. She's hopeful, which is different. Suze Ramirez, the Mystery Shack's handyman, appears in the very first episode and remains one of the show's most consistent sources of both humor and warmth. His backstory, a father who sent him birthday cards every year but never showed up, a grandmother who raised him and who he loves unconditionally, a dream of having a father figure that Stan, to Stan's own considerable surprise, ends up fulfilling in ways neither of them anticipated, runs quietly through the series as one of its most genuinely affecting threads. Suze is exactly as simple as he appears on the surface and exactly as complex underneath. He is deeply, genuinely good, and the show rewards that rather than punishing it. Wendy Corduroy, the teenage cashier, who becomes the twins' friend and the older sibling figure they didn't know they needed, carries her own backstory that deepens as the series progresses. She is from the Corduroy family, which means, though nobody knows it in the early episodes, that she is a descendant of Archibald Corduroy, the lumberjack whose ghost would come back to haunt the Northwests 150 years after his death. The connection is revealed in Journal 3 rather than in the show itself, and it adds texture to a character who initially seems like she exists mostly to be cool and relatable to the teenage audience. But back to what the summer means. The summer in Gravity Falls is a liminal space. The show is explicitly aware of this. It is set across a single summer, it ends when the summer ends, and the awareness that the season is finite creates a particular emotional register throughout. This summer is temporary. Everything about it is predicated on the fact that it will end, that Dipper and Mabel will go back to Piedmont, that the mysteries will be solved or left unsolved, that the relationships formed here will have to survive the distance that comes after. Gravity Falls as a setting is itself a liminal place, a town where the rules are different, where the impossible is possible, where the normal constraints on reality are loosened just enough to let extraordinary things happen. The twins arrived on the bus from the normal world and entered somewhere else entirely. And the show understands, with unusual clarity for a children's animated series, that the most painful thing about liminal spaces is that they always end. Section 12. Bill's long game. Every time, he was already there. Here is something that becomes clearer every time you watch the show over again. Bill Cipher was present in the story of Gravity Falls long before his first on-screen appearance. His first actual scene is in Season 1, Episode 11, Dreamscaperers, when Gideon Gleeful summons him to help steal the deed to the Mystery Shack from Stan's mind. Bill arrives with all the theatrical confidence of someone who has been waiting for an invitation and is delighted it finally arrived. And he delivers a monologue about the nature of reality that is genuinely entertaining and genuinely disturbing, and serves as a perfect introduction to a character who will go on to be one of the more memorable animated villains of the past 15 years. But he was there before that, much earlier than that. The rugs in the Mystery Shack. There is a rug in the shack's main room that features a triangle with a single eye, Bill's face. It has been there since the first episode. It is just a rug. Except it's a rug decorated with the face of an interdimensional dream demon who has been manipulating the occupants of the shack for years. which gives it a slightly different quality once you know what you're looking at. The window in the shack's attic, where Dipper and Mabel sleep. There is a stained glass triangle worked into the window. Bill again. Watching from inside the house, watching from the room where the children sleep. There since the beginning. Visible if you knew what to look for. Invisible if you didn't. The opening credits. Beyond the Bill Cipher wheel already mentioned, there are flashes of imagery throughout the show's opening sequence that include Bill's triangular form in various configurations. He is in the opening credits of every single episode of both seasons. He is there from the first moment to the last, present in the frame even when absent from the story. And then there's the glowing eyes in the trees during the pilot, when Dipper first finds Journal 3. The eyes in the forest, watching. The implication is clear by the time you know the show's mythology. Bill had been watching Gravity Falls for decades, had been orchestrating events in ways that were designed to eventually lead to the portal's reactivation and his entry into the physical world, and he was there attentive and patient when the next generation of Pine's children arrived and began asking questions that would eventually serve his purposes. This is the thing about Bill that is genuinely frightening rather than just theatrically scary. He plays the very long game. He is over 1 trillion years old. He has infinite patience. He doesn't need things to happen fast. He can plant a seed and wait 50 years for it to grow into something useful. He can arrange circumstances so that multiple generations of people make exactly the choices he needed them to make, without any single one of them understanding that they were being steered. Ford thought he was having an intellectual partnership with a benevolent entity. He was serving Bill's agenda, which is not the same thing at all. Bill's appearances and Stan's memories glimpsed in Dreamscaperers, when he invades Stan's mind to search for the safe combination, show a younger Ford, sitting in the background of family memories with a book in front of his face, partially obscuring it. Ford is present in Stan's earliest memories, even the ones he barely registers consciously. The connection between Ford and Stan runs so deep that even 30 years of separation and estrangement can't keep Ford out of the architecture of Stan's mind. When Gideon asks Bill to retrieve the deed from Stan's memory, Bill wanders through a mindscape full of carefully preserved family history, because that's what Stan's mind is built from. In Sock Opera, Season 2's second episode, Bill manipulates Dipper into a deal to use his body to put on a puppet show. And Bill will give him information. This is peak Bill. He identifies Dipper's specific vulnerability, his desire to prove himself, his longing for answers, his inability to resist a bargain that looks good, and exploits it precisely. The possession sequence, where Bill walks around in Dipper's body with obvious relish, smashing and burning things, and threatening to hurt Mabel, is one of the show's darker moments. Bill is not just a cartoon villain who announces his evil plans. He is something that genuinely enjoys inflicting fear and pain, and the joy he takes in it during the possession makes his casual cruelty visceral in a way that the show rarely lets itself be. His relationship with Ford, before the portal, was something more complex. Ford's journal and the book of Bill's expanded account suggest that Bill was not purely performing in their interactions. He chose Ford specifically because Ford was extraordinary, and he appears to have felt something like genuine intellectual pleasure in their partnership. This does not make Bill good or even sympathetic, but it means the manipulation wasn't entirely hollow. There was something real in it. Something that makes Ford's eventual understanding of what he'd been part of more painful rather than less. He wasn't conned by a machine. He was conned by something that genuinely found him interesting. In Dreamscaperers, when Gideon summons Bill and mentions Stanford Pines, Bill's eye flickers with an image of Ford's face, not Stan's. Bill knows the real Stanford Pines. He knows the history. He knows that the person living in the shack is not the person whose name he's wearing, and he has known this for 30 years. He has let it continue because the portal being rebuilt is useful to his plans. Stan, unknowingly, has been doing exactly what Bill needed. The symbol Bill uses the triangle. The Eye of Providence is everywhere in Gravity Falls, and always has been. On the dollar bill, in the United States' own iconography, the show suggests, in one of its more audacious moments of world-building, that the Eye of Providence on the American currency is not a coincidence. Bill has been part of the visual vocabulary of American culture for longer than most people have been paying attention. He was always there. He was always watching. The story of Gravity Falls is, in one reading, the story of how long and how well he waited, and what it finally took to stop him. Section 13. The Northwest Legacy Classism, Curses, and the Weight of Old Sins. Gravity Falls, Oregon has a founding story. Like most founding stories, it is not quite true. The official version: the town was founded by Nathaniel Northwest, intrepid pioneer, visionary leader, beloved patriarch of a long and distinguished family whose descendants continue to be the most prominent citizens in Gravity Falls to this day. The Northwests have a mansion on the hill. They throw an annual party to which only the richest and most powerful guests are invited. They consider themselves, without excessive subtlety, to be the best family in town, and they have worked hard over many generations to ensure that this belief is shared, or at least accepted, by those around them. The real version: the town was actually founded by Sir Lord Quentin Tremblay III, the 85th President of the United States, who arrived in the valley after his horse threw him off a cliff and decided this was as good a place as any to establish a settlement. Tremblay himself was brilliant and thoroughly unconventional. He ate directly from serving dishes. He was sworn in as president on a stack of waffles. He issued executive orders about silly things in between issuing others that were apparently quite good policy. The United States government, finding him embarrassing, erased him from official history. Nathaniel Northwest was installed as the official founder. The Northwest family has been credited with the establishment of Gravity Falls ever since, which is to say they have been credited with something they did not do for approximately 150 years. That's the first layer of Northwest dishonesty. The second layer is considerably darker. When Nathaniel Northwest wanted a mansion, he didn't build it himself. He hired the lumberjacks of Gravity Falls working people, tradespeople, the kind of people who built things with their hands and took pride in it, and he made them a promise. Build us this mansion, and once a year, we will throw a party open to all of Gravity Falls. The common folk would be welcomed alongside the wealthy. The gates would always be open on that one night. The lumberjacks built the mansion. They worked for years to complete it. People died in the process. The construction was difficult. The terrain was unforgiving, and the deforestation required to source the lumber created geological instability that eventually contributed to a mudslide. A man named Archibald Corduroy was working at the mansion site when that mudslide hit. He was struck by a falling axe, the particular cruelty of dying the way a lumberjack should be most afraid of dying, and he died slowly enough to leave behind a curse. 150 years I'll return from death, Archibald swore with his last breath. And if the gates still close to town, wealthy blood will stain the ground. The Northwests heard the curse. They wrote it down. They passed it through generations as a warning that they never quite took seriously enough to actually do anything about, because doing something about it would have required them to let the common people of Gravity Falls into their party, which was unacceptable. They preferred to risk the supernatural vengeance of a murdered lumberjack over the social contamination of having the wrong kind of guests at their gathering. For 150 years, every time the annual party rolled around, the Northwests locked the gates and kept the townspeople out. Every year, the curse's deadline got a little closer. They knew. They chose it anyway. Preston Northwest, the family patriarch in the summer of 2012, is one of the show's most precisely observed villains. He is not dramatic. He is not theatrical. He does not monologue about his plans or rub his hands together. He is simply a man who has completely internalized the belief that his family's wealth and prestige entitle them to treat other people as less important than their own comfort, and who acts on that belief consistently and without apology. When his daughter Pacifica looks at him with something that might be the beginning of conscience, he rings a bell, a literal bell, that he has trained her to respond to with instant compliance through years of Pavlovian conditioning, and the conscience retreats. The bell is important. It appears for the first time when Pacifica arrives at the Mystery Shack to ask Dipper for help. And she starts to say something honest before her father's voice in her head, the internalized bell, the learned helplessness, shuts her down. The show is not subtle about what the bell represents. It is the mechanism of a parent who has trained a child to be useful, rather than to be herself. Pacifica's arc, across the episode Northwest Mansion Mystery, and the episodes that follow, is about learning that she has her own will independent of the bell, that her father's approval is not the measure of her worth, that the legacy of dishonesty and exploitation she's inherited is not her identity. Archibald Corduroy's ghost arrives on the anniversary of the mansion's completion, 150 years to the day. He is not subtle either. Blue flames for hair and beard, a missing eye, an axe embedded in his skull from the moment of his death. He smells Northwest blood, and he comes through the fireplace like something out of a gothic horror story, and he begins turning the party guests into wood literally, not metaphorically. Wood because the curse is real and it has arrived, and the gates are still closed. The episode that follows Northwest Mansion Mystery is the show at its most elegant. Dipper's involvement gives Pacifica access to someone who is willing to see past the family performance and interact with her as a person. The ghost's backstory reframes the entire Northwest legacy as what it is: power built on broken promises and the suffering of people who were too poor and too unimportant to make the Northwest's care. The animal heads on the wall chanting "Ancient Sins" is one of the show's most genuinely frightening images. And it's frightening, partly because it's not metaphorical. It is literally the sins of the family's ancestors returning to demand accounting. When Pacifica opens the gate, when she defies her father and the bell, and the conditioned compliance of her entire childhood, and pulls the lever that lets the common folk into the party, the show makes it a genuinely heroic moment. She is 12 years old. She is doing something that every generation of her family has refused to do for 150 years. And she does it knowing that her father will be furious, knowing that the life of carefully maintained privilege she's been raised in is about to shift in ways she can't predict. The ghost is appeased. The curse is lifted. Archibald Corduroy tells Pacifica she is not like the other Northwests, and he means it as the highest compliment he can give. And then he moves on, after 150 years of waiting, because someone finally did the right thing. The postscript, in the Book of Bill, reveals that Archibald and the spirits of the other lumberjacks continued to watch over Pacifica after the curse was lifted. That in her dreams, Archibald talks to her. Not to threaten or to demand he'd gotten what he came back for, but because, it's implied, he genuinely cares about the girl who was brave enough to be different from everything her family taught her to be. Wendy Corduroy, it's confirmed in Journal 3, is a direct descendant of Archibald. Which means that the two families, the one that wronged and the one that was wronged, have been living in the same small town for 150 years, and the children of those families became friends during the summer of 2012. And one of them eventually helped the other break a generational curse that should have been broken a century ago. Gravity Falls is a small town. The histories run close together there. Every family story eventually touches another one. Section 14. Ford returns reunion and reckoning. The portal is not a clean machine. When it activates, when Stan throws the final switches, and the energy builds, and the spinning gateway opens, and Ford comes through it, is spectacular and dangerous, and produces a burst of gravitational anomalies that pulls the attention of two government agents who have been watching the shack for weeks. Everything happens at once. Ford's return, the government intervention, Mabel's choice to trust Stan, the revelation of who Stan actually is and what he has been doing in the basement for 30 years. The episode titled, Not What He Seems, is the payoff on a season and a half of careful setup. The opening credit message, Stan is not what he seems, finally resolves. The story Stan has been carrying alone for 30 years finally surfaces, and the people who care about him most have to decide what to do with it. Ford comes through the portal looking like a man who has survived 30 years in places that weren't designed for human survival, which is exactly what he is. He is older, harder, carrying experiences that no one in the physical world could fully understand. He has a metal plate in his head, installed after a particularly dangerous encounter in another dimension, that prevents anything from reading or entering his mind. He has survived, because Ford is extraordinary, but survival is not the same as being undamaged. The reunion between Stan and Ford is one of the most carefully written scenes in the show. 3 decades of devotion, on Stan's side, have been met with 3 decades of not knowing, on Ford's side. Ford didn't know Stan was working to bring him back. He didn't know he was being rescued. He left through the portal in the middle of an argument and arrived back in the world 30 years later to find his brother wearing his name. Running a tourist trap built around fake versions of the phenomena Ford had spent his life studying. In the house, Ford built with his own hands. The conflicting emotions in that room are enormous. Stan's pride and relief, Ford's gratitude and confusion, and the old resentment that never fully healed. The awareness, on both sides, that 30 years of separation have made them different people in ways neither has fully cataloged yet. The episode, A Tale of Two Stans, fills in the history, tells the story of Glass Shard Beach, the perpetual motion machine, the scholarship, the exile, the decades of failed enterprises, the postcard from Ford, the arrival in Gravity Falls, the accident of the fight that sent Ford through the portal, and the decision Stan made in the aftermath. It is one of the show's best episodes and one of its most emotionally dense. By the end of it, you understand exactly how these two people ended up where they are and exactly why it's so complicated between them. Ford's relationship with Dipper is another layer that develops from this point forward. Ford sees in Dipper a version of his young self, the curiosity, the drive, the particular intensity of a person who wants desperately to understand the world and feels somewhat out of place among people who don't share that desire. He offers Dipper an apprenticeship. He sees the boy as a protege, a successor, someone to carry on the research Ford never completed. What Ford doesn't see clearly enough is that Dipper is not him. Dipper has Mabel. His identity is not solitary the way Ford's was. His passion for knowledge exists alongside his love for his sister, his friendships, his family, and these are not liabilities to be shed in the name of research. They're what makes him himself. Ford's failure to understand this, his projection of his own youthful isolation onto Dipper, sets up a conflict that becomes one of the primary drivers of the show's final arc. Mabel watches Ford take Dipper away to do research and feels the twins' partnership shifting. She watches her brother get excited about a future that might not include her. And she is frightened, not because she's selfish, but because she can see, with a clarity that Dipper at 12 doesn't yet have, that the thing Ford is offering isn't just an opportunity. It's a choice between staying with Mabel and going somewhere new. That fear is the crack that Bill eventually finds and widens into a catastrophe. But we're not there yet. For now, Ford is back. The summer is entering its final phase. The portal has been activated and closed, but it has left something behind, a tear in the dimensional fabric, a rift that sits in a containment sphere in Ford's laboratory and slowly grows less stable as the weeks pass. And in the nightmare realm, Bill watches the rift and waits for his moment. Section 15. The Rift and the Road to Weirdmageddon. August in Gravity Falls. The summer is almost over. Dipper and Mabel's 13th birthday, August 31st, the last day of summer, the last day before everything changes, is 1 week away. Mabel wakes up that morning thinking about birthday parties and decorations, and the last perfect week of something she's not entirely ready to let go of. Dipper wakes up thinking about the future, about Ford's offer, about the shape of a life that involves staying in Gravity Falls and continuing the research rather than getting back on a bus to Piedmont. The twins don't talk to each other about either of these things. That's the failure point, the place where communication breaks down and Bill gets through. Ford shows Dipper the rift, the interdimensional tear left behind by the portal's activation. Sealed in a containment sphere the size of a snow globe, slowly destabilizing. He explains what will happen if the containment fails. Bill will gain access to the physical world. Weirdmageddon will begin. The barrier between the nightmare realm and reality will collapse, and what comes through will be everything Bill has been preparing to release for the better part of 1 trillion years. Ford and Dipper leave the shack to find materials to reseal the containment. And in their absence, Mabel is alone with the weight of everything she's feeling. Mabel visits Gravity Falls High School with Suze to plan the birthday party. What she finds there is not reassuring. The school has the particular energy of a place that runs on social hierarchies and mandatory conformity, where the joy she's used to feeling in social situations would be channeled and redirected rather than expressed. Wendy, who knows what high school is actually like, tries to prepare Mabel. What comes out instead is a picture of something Mabel is not equipped for, a place where who you are is constantly evaluated, where the things that make Mabel Mabel are not automatically assets. The sign outside the school, as Suze and Mabel drive away, has been rearranged to read, "No escape." Mabel is spiraling. She is approaching her 13th birthday the way someone approaches a door they're not sure they want to open. On the other side is high school and growing up, and the loss of the summer and everything the summer has meant. She doesn't want to go through it. Then Blendon Blandon appears. Blendon is a time traveler, a recurring character in the series, a mostly harmless agent of the Time Paradox Avoidance Enforcement Squadron, who has had a number of unfortunate adventures involving the Gravity Falls timeline. His appearance seems harmless. He approaches Mabel and tells her he can offer her a gift: more summer, endless summer, the summer that never ends. He asks for the rift in exchange. Mabel doesn't know what the rift is. She hasn't been told. Dipper and Ford were so caught up in their research mission that nobody stopped to explain to Mabel what the snow globe thing in the lab actually was, or why it mattered, or what would happen if someone gave it to the wrong person. In the rush and the secrecy of Ford's paranoia and Dipper's excitement, the most basic communication step, telling Mabel what was at stake, didn't happen. She finds the rift in Dipper's backpack. She takes it to Blendon. And the moment she hands it over, Blendon's eyes change. The pupils go wrong. He takes off his goggles, and his eyes are yellow and triangular, and he laughs with a voice that hasn't been in that body before that moment. The Blendon standing in front of Mabel is Bill Cipher. He smashes the rift. The containment shatters. The gateway between the nightmare realm and the physical world tears open, and from somewhere very far away and very close at once, something enormous and ancient and delighted begins to move. The last thing Mabel sees before she loses consciousness is Bill's real form rising through the dimensional tier, ascending into the sky above Gravity Falls with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting for this moment for a very, very long time. Finally, Bill says, and Weirdmageddon begins. The brilliance and the tragedy of this sequence is that nobody is simply wrong. Mabel's fear of growing up is real and understandable. Dipper's excitement about Ford's offer is real and understandable. Ford's paranoia about the rift's security is understandable, given 30 years of being hunted through dimensions. And Bill's exploitation of all of these things is the work of an entity that has spent 1 trillion years learning exactly which levers to pull. The breakdown happened because a family that loved each other wasn't talking. Because the adults in the room made assumptions. Because the 12-year-old girl at the center of it was afraid and alone at exactly the moment she needed to not be. Bill didn't create the vulnerability. He just found it, the way he always finds them, and applied exactly the right amount of pressure. It was prophesied for 1 billion years, he announces when he rises through the rift. And in that sense, from his perspective, it has been. Section 16. Weirdmageddon, what it looks like when the rules break. The sky above Gravity Falls turns. Colors that don't belong in nature, colors that belong to the nightmare realm and its particular visual vocabulary, bleed through from whatever lies on the other side of the dimensional tear. The air smells different. The light is wrong. The rock formations that have always looked a little unusual now look actively threatening in the new context of what's happening around them. Bill descends in his physical form, not the floating triangle of the mindscape, but something that has solidified in the third dimension, enormous and radiantly, wrongly bright. He calls his associates through from the nightmare realm, the Henchmaniacs, a collection of interdimensional criminals and chaos agents who have been waiting in the wings for exactly this moment. 8-ball. Teeth. Keyhole. The horrifying, sweaty, one-armed monstrosity. Creatures from dimensions and dream states that have no names in human languages, all of them pouring through the tier and immediately getting to work. Eyebats, enormous flying eyeballs, with bat wings swarm through the town, turning anyone they encounter into stone. People who are walking to their cars, eating breakfast, doing their ordinary morning things, are frozen mid-motion, their expressions locked into whatever they were feeling the moment the eyebats reached them. The resulting images, people frozen in the middle of conversations, in the middle of arguments, in the middle of completely mundane acts, have a particular horror to them. The horror of life interrupted without warning or dignity. Bill builds the pyramid. A giant structure of black and gold geometric shapes that rises in the center of Gravity Falls. Impossibly large. Architecturally wrong, in the way that things in the nightmare realm are structurally wrong-sized for something that isn't human, decorated in a visual language that isn't meant for human eyes. At its peak, Bill installs a throne made from the petrified bodies of the people his eyebats have frozen. He stacks them like furniture. He sits among them. In the chaos of the first day, Bill captures Mabel. He seals her in a prison bubble between the hanging cliffs, a sphere of hardened reality with a lock, hovering in the weirdness-saturated air. Ford is captured and encased in solid gold. The government agents who had been investigating the shack are neutralized. Most of the town has been petrified or chased into hiding. Dipper is essentially alone. He has 3 days before he makes the decision that Ford told him not to make. He goes after Mabel instead of going after Bill. He prioritizes his sister over strategy. He chooses family over the rational calculus that says stopping the villain is more important than saving one person. This is not an accident. The show understands that the choice to rescue one person over saving the world is not an obviously wrong choice, and it presents it without judgment. Dipper knows what the risks are. He chooses Mabel anyway. And the act of choosing her, of putting her ahead of the strategy, is both the right choice emotionally and in the end, the choice that makes everything else possible. Because you cannot defeat Bill Cipher with strategy alone. The final confrontation requires something that strategy can't build. A family that loves each other enough to make an impossible sacrifice. Bill has surrounded himself in the pyramid with his throne of human misery, and he is, by all appearances, having the time of his enormously long life. He announces his plans in the theatrical manner of someone who has been patient for so long that now he is going to be very, very loud. He wants to expand Weirdmageddon globally. He wants to take his particular brand of chaos to every corner of the physical world and then onward. The universe, he announces, is going to be his personal party. He hits a wall. Literally. The weirdness magnetism of gravity falls the property that has drawn paranormal activity to the valley for millions of years. Ever since the UFO crash that started it, all acts as a cage in reverse. The same force that made the town a gateway is now preventing the chaos from spreading beyond its borders. Bill and his henchmaniacs reach the edge of Gravity Falls and bounce back. They hit the boundary again. They bounce back again. Bill is trapped. This is an important detail, because it introduces the crucial flaw in Bill's plan. He has achieved the physical form he's wanted for 1 trillion years. He has unleashed his reality-warping powers on a dimension that cannot naturally defend itself. He has won, by every measure he intended to win by. And then he discovers that the town itself is working against him, that the geology and history that made Gravity Falls useful to his plan are now constraining the results. The barrier, Ford eventually reveals, is related to the weirdness field generated by the buried UFO. The same crash that created the anomalies that drew Ford to Gravity Falls, the same phenomenon that made Bill want the portal built here. Specifically, it has a secondary effect that Bill either didn't know about or couldn't account for. The weirdness magnetism doesn't just pull things in. Under the right conditions, it keeps them in. To expand Weirdmageddon, Bill needs to know how to collapse the barrier, and the one person who might have figured that out is Ford. Which is why, when Ford is captured, Bill tries to torture the equation out of him. And Ford, with a metal plate in his head that prevents Bill from simply taking the information, refuses to give it. The survivors in the Mystery Shack are making other plans. Section 17. Mabeland, what Bill built for a 12-year-old. The prison bubble is, in some ways, the most psychologically precise thing Bill Cipher ever created. He could have imprisoned Mabel in something terrible. He's perfectly capable of terrible. He puts people in a frozen throne made from their own petrified bodies. He is clearly not squeamish about the suffering of others. But he puts Mabel specifically in something that isn't terrible at all, something that's actually, on the surface, perfect. He puts her in a world where everything she loves is real, where everything she wants is provided, where the fears that drove her to give him the rift in the first place have been addressed and resolved and wrapped in bright colors and 80s music. This is the Nightmare Realm's understanding of Mabel Pines. She is afraid of growing up, so give her a world where she never has to. She misses things and people and moments, so make all of them accessible. She loves her brother but fears losing him, so build a replacement, Dippy Fresh, a version of Dipper who is supportive without being challenging, agreeable without being honest, everything a scared 12-year-old might want from a twin, and nothing that the real one would actually be. The world inside the prison bubble is called Mabeland, and it is absolutely, relentlessly, suffocatingly wonderful. Candy-colored landscapes, Creatures made from every piece of Mabel's inner world. Xyler and Kraz, the 80s heartthrobs from her fantasy, running a tour of the paradise she's been given. A giant waddles serving as public transportation. A castle at the center, with Mabel installed as the unquestioned queen of everything she's ever dreamed of. And the one rule in Mabeland, the one thing the tour guides mention and immediately dismiss as not worth worrying about. The one prohibition, whose content they refuse to specify, is that no one can choose to leave. When Dipper, Seuss, and Wendy enter the bubble to rescue Mabel, they are immediately confronted with the seduction of the place. Seuss finds his father there, the absent father who sent birthday cards but never showed up. Now present and engaged, and exactly what Seuss needed him to be. The bubble reads people. It gives them what they want. It is a perfect trap, because it doesn't feel like a trap, it feels like a gift, or a dream, or the version of the world you've always secretly wanted to inhabit. Dipper is immune to the full seduction because the thing he wants most is to rescue Mabel, and the bubble can only offer him secondary desires, a version of Wendy who likes him as more than a friend, a world where he's celebrated and understood. But he keeps saying no, keeps orienting himself toward the exit, keeps trying to remind Mabel and himself that the real world needs them. The trial scene, where Mabel's court sits in judgment on the question of whether they should stay or go, is one of the show's most clever set pieces. The jury is made of Mabel's dreams, animated stuffed animals wearing her signature sweaters, creatures from her imagination serving as witnesses. The judge is a kitten in a wig, and the charge is essentially this. Dipper is trying to take Mabel back to a world that frightened her, and the world she's currently in is better than the one he's offering. He makes his case. He tells Mabel that the real world isn't perfect, that growing up is genuinely scary, that she's right to be afraid of high school and change and the end of the summer and everything that comes after. He doesn't pretend that these fears are irrational. He acknowledges that Mabeland is wonderful, and that what he's asking her to choose over at reality, with all its uncertainty and difficulty and inevitable loss, is objectively harder. But he tells her that the real world has something Mabeland doesn't, and that something is the actual people she loves, with all their imperfections and complications and the ways they sometimes disappoint each other, which is what makes loving them mean something. Mabeland has a version of Dipper who never disagrees with Mabel. The real Dipper argues with her constantly and means every word, and is right about roughly half of it and wrong about the other half, and neither of them would change that dynamic for anything. Because the arguing is the relationship, the disagreements are the evidence of two people who take each other seriously enough to tell each other the truth. Mabel chooses to leave. She pops the bubble with a giant knitting needle. Because of course it's a giant knitting needle. Because this is Mabel Pines and comes back into the real world, which is currently being destroyed by an interdimensional dream demon. And she immediately starts figuring out how to help. The moment Mabel chooses to leave Mabeland is, quietly, the moment she crosses from childhood into something else. Not adulthood, she's 12, she has years of growing to do. But she makes a conscious choice to face reality rather than retreat from it. To love the imperfect actual people in her life, rather than settle for the perfect imaginary versions of them, and that choice costs her something real. The paradise she's leaving was genuinely nice. Choosing the real world over it is not an easy call. It's just the right one. Section 18. The final sacrifice stands gambit. In the end, the plan is almost embarrassingly simple. Ford's mind is inaccessible to Bill because of the metal plate. But if Bill could enter Ford's mind, the mind of the man who designed the portal and knows the equation to collapse Gravity Falls' weirdness barrier, he could finally escape the town and continue his reign. Worldwide. Ford's plan. Allow Bill to enter what appears to be his mind. In actuality, it will be Stan's mind. Ford and Stan will switch clothes, and Ford will shout instructions to Stan about what memories to think of and how to behave, to maintain the deception long enough for Ford to aim the memory gun. The memory gun, pointed at Stan's head while Bill burns inside it, will erase everything Bill needs to continue existing, the patterns and memories and accumulated moments that give him purchase in a human mind. Bill, inside a mind that has been erased around him, will have nothing to hold on to. He will be destroyed. Stan will lose his memories. Not some of them. All of them. Or at least, all of them relevant to what Bill is burning through, which is most of what Stan Pines has ever been, has ever known, has ever loved. 30 years of running the Mystery Shack. The summer with Dipper and Mabel. The portal. The mission. Ford. All of it, gone. This is the sacrifice. Not death. Something possibly worse. Surviving. But as someone who doesn't know who he is anymore. Stan doesn't hesitate. He has been protecting things that mattered more than himself for 30 years without telling anyone. He protected Ford for 3 decades without Ford knowing. He protected the summer, kept Dipper and Mabel as safe as he could while the portal built toward its dangerous conclusion, managed the threat without exposing them to more of it than necessary. He protected the mission at the cost of his identity, his freedom, his name. He is, in the deepest and most private part of himself, a man who protects the people he loves by sacrificing things that other people value more than he does. He values his memories. He does. But not more than Ford, not more than the twins, not more than the world. He says yes. The final confrontation with Bill and Stan's mindscape is one of the most genuinely moving things Gravity Falls ever did. Bill arrives expecting Ford's mind, the ordered, brilliant, precisely maintained architecture of a genius scientist, and instead finds Stan's, which is chaos and warmth and 30 years of tourist trap nonsense and the cluttered, generous, complicated interior of someone who has never been as simple as he seemed. Bill does not find the equation he needs. He finds Stan. And Stan, who has spent 30 years maintaining a deception more complex than anything Bill has ever managed, who has been conning people since he was 17 years old, who is exactly as smart as Ford in the ways that actually matter in that moment, punches him. He punches a trillion-year-old interdimensional demon in the face. And because he's doing it in the mindscape, in the space between memory and meaning, in the place where the physical laws of the third dimension have limited purchase, the punch connects in exactly the way it needs to. Bill shatters. The pieces scatter. The mindscape begins to go dark. Outside, Ford fires the memory gun. Stan survives the physical process. He walks out of his own head and into the ruined street outside the former pyramid. Weirdmageddon ends, the dimensional rift closes. The henchmaniacs are pulled back through the Nightmare Realm's door. The petrification reverses itself across Gravity Falls as the effects of Bill's reign unwind. The sky returns to Oregon normal. The town is still a wreck, but it is a real wreck, a wreck in the actual world, and that is better than the alternatives. Stan doesn't know any of them. He looks at Ford and Dipper and Mabel and Seuss and Wendy and the assembled survivors of Weirdmageddon, and he sees people he doesn't recognize. His face has the specific blankness of someone whose interior has been cleared out, and in the shock of that, watching someone they love look back at them with no recognition, the people who love him are briefly destroyed. And then Mabel opens her scrapbook. All summer, Mabel has been making a scrapbook of their time in Gravity Falls. Every adventure documented, every friendship commemorated, every strange and terrifying and wonderful moment of the summer preserved in photographs and tickets and scraps and drawings and the accumulated material evidence that this summer happened. That the people in it were real and mattered. She sits with Stan in the wreckage of the Mystery Shack and shows him the pictures, one by one, slowly. And something in the images, some echo of the person he was before, some trace of the things that made him himself, begins to find its way back. Memory is not just neurons. It's not just data. It's relationship and habit and the way your face changes when you're with specific people. And Stan's face, as Mabel turns the pages of the scrapbook, slowly stops being blank. He comes back. Not all the way, not instantly, not without cost. But he comes back. Waddles wanders into the room, and Stan's face does the thing it does when something genuinely delights him. And something in that involuntary reaction, the stubbornness of love persisting even through erasure, pulls the rest of him forward. He comes back. He remembers the twins. He remembers Ford. He remembers 30 years, and the portal and the tourist trap and the summer. The scrapbook gave him a thread to follow back to himself, and he followed it. Section 19. The axolotl and what comes after, the poem that changes everything. Bill Cipher's final words, when played in reverse, are not silence. They are a message, Axolotl. My time has come to burn. I invoke the ancient power that I may return. Most people who watched the finale heard static. A few people, working with recording software, and the particular obsessive patience that Gravity Falls rewarded, reversed the audio and found the message. And the message opens a door into the show's mythology that extends further than anything shown on screen. The axolotl is a being mentioned in passing in the main series but central to the show's extended lore. An entity of enormous power, described in the mythology as ranking above Time Baby, above Bill, above most of the powerful forces that operate in the multiverse, who exists in the time and space between time and space, and who apparently serves some function in the cosmic order of things that has never been fully specified. In a choose-your-own-adventure novel called Dipper and Mabel and the Curse of the Time Pirate's Treasure, a non-canonical but lore-significant book that Alex Hirsch confirmed contains an enormous canon secret, there is a hidden ending accessible through a coded website link embedded in the book's pages. In this ending, Dipper and Mabel fall through a time vortex and find themselves in the space between dimensions, where they encounter the axolotl, an enormous, majestic, talking axolotl who offers each of them a question. Mabel asks, "Who are you?" The axolotl replies, "The axolotl." Dipper asks, "What do you know about Bill Cipher?" And the axolotl, in verse, gives this answer: 60 degrees that come in threes. Watches from within birch trees. Saw his own dimension burn. Misses home and can't return. Says he's happy. He's a liar. Blame the arson for the fire. If he wants to shirk the blame, he'll have to invoke my name. One way to absolve his crime. A different form, a different time. Unpack that, line by line. 60 degrees that come in threes. Bill is an equilateral triangle. Every angle in an equilateral triangle is 60 degrees. 3 angles. Simple descriptor, but it grounds everything else in the poem in a specificity that says, this is the genuine article. The axolotl knows exactly who it's describing. Watches from within birch trees. Bill watches. He has always watched. The eyes in the forest during the pilot, the sense of constant surveillance that runs through the show, the axolotl confirms that this is his nature, his constant state. He is always present, always observing. Saw his own dimension burn. Euclidia. The second dimension. Gone now, for longer than civilization has existed. Bill saw it burn because Bill burned it, whatever the exact mechanics of that burning were. This is the crime at the center of everything. The thing that made him what he is, the thing that he has spent 1 trillion years trying to justify, misses home and can't return. This is the line that recontextualizes Bill. Not just a monster. Something that was once from somewhere. Something that had a home and lost it through its own actions and cannot go back. The loneliness in this line is enormous. Not sympathy. You can't quite get to sympathy for something that tried to freeze the entire population of a small Oregon town in the name of a party. But context, background. The thing that lies behind the chaos. Says he's happy. He's a liar. Bill's entire presentation is a performance of delight. He is always having the time of his life, always grinning, always finding everything hilarious and exciting and worth crowing about. The axolotl cuts through it in 4 words. He's not happy. He hasn't been happy in a very long time. The chaos and the power and the parties are the behavior of something that has been running from a specific grief for 1 trillion years and hasn't stopped long enough to look at it directly. Blame the arson for the fire. He destroyed Euclidia. The destruction was not something that happened to him. He caused it. Whatever the exact circumstances, whatever the interplay of accident and intention, the fire was his. The poem doesn't give him an out on this. If he wants to shirk the blame, he'll have to invoke my name. And here is the mechanism. Here is what Bill's reversed final words are reaching for. If Bill wants any possibility of something other than the obliteration that stands punch, represents any possibility of continuation, of a second chance at something better, he has to call on the axolotl. And he does. The reversed message is the invocation. One way to absolve his crime, a different form, a different time. The Book of Bill, published in 2024, shows what comes after the invocation. Bill, Shattered and barely coherent, finds himself in the presence of the axolotl, who appears there as an axolotl-shaped nebula. Vast and luminous and patient. Bill pleads his case with characteristic bravado. He's too cool to die. He and the axolotl are basically the same level of deity. Surely this can be worked out. He tries to bargain. He tries to charm. He tries the approach that has worked on every other being he's ever dealt with. The axolotl is not charmed. The axolotl tells Bill that he cannot regrow through denial, that he'll have to face the axolotl's hardest trial. That if he completes the program, genuinely completes it, not performs completion while remaining unchanged, he might live again. Bill rejoices. He thinks he's beaten the system. He thinks he's getting a second chance to do everything he just finished doing, but better, with better odds. He hasn't been listening carefully enough. The axolotl's program is the Theraprism, a rehabilitation facility outside of space and time. Dimension 5150, where Bill is sent to confront everything he has refused to confront since the burning of Euclidia. The grief, the guilt, the loneliness, the trillion years of running, the truth about what he did and what it cost. The Theraprism is not punishment in the conventional sense. It is the most precise possible response to someone who has been fleeing the same moment for a trillion years. It makes him stop and look at it. The Book of Bill is structured as Bill's attempt to escape the Theraprism by writing a book and getting it out to readers in the physical world. He spends the book presenting himself as the same gleeful chaos agent he's always been, making deals, dropping hints, trying to build toward a physical return. But in the cracks between the bravado, in the moments when his narration glitches and goes honest for a sentence or two, you can see what the Theraprism is doing to him. You can see the thing underneath the performance. By the end of the book, the Theraprism confiscates the project and cuts off Bill's outside contact. Bill's final statement, before the connection is severed, is defiant. He hasn't changed. He never will. There will always be another, but it lands differently than it would have before the book walked you through the evidence. You can hear the denial in it now. You can hear the axolotl's assessment, accurate and unsparing. He's not happy. He's a liar. Whether Bill will ever complete the Theraprism program, whether the poem's promise of a different form, a different time will ever materialize, whether there is some future version of this story in which Bill becomes something other than what he is, these questions remain open. Hirsch has never confirmed a resolution. The mythology extends forward into speculation from here, and the axolotl's poem is the last concrete thing we have to work with. It is enough. It is more than enough. It is a piece of writing that rewards everything Gravity Falls asked of its audience: the patience, the attention, the willingness to follow the cipher wherever it led, and arrives at a conclusion that is neither triumphant nor despairing, but something more honest than either. This is what happened, and this is what it means. And the rest is up to you to feel. Section 20. The Legacy of Gravity Falls. What the show was always teaching. The bus back to Piedmont leaves in the early morning, in the kind of light that happens at the end of summer when everything is slightly golden and slightly sad, and you can feel the season shifting under your feet like sand. Dipper and Mabel stand outside the Mystery Shack one last time. The friends and family who have gathered there, Suze and Wendy, and the townspeople who came through Weirdmageddon alongside them, Stan and Ford, who will be heading toward the open ocean, and whatever anomalies await them there, have all come to say goodbye. Wendy gives Dipper her hat. She gives him an envelope and tells him to open it on the bus. It contains a note with signatures from everyone: Stan, Ford, Suze, Wendy, Pacifica, Candy, Grenda, and a message. See you next summer. The bus pulls out of Gravity Falls. The town disappears behind the trees. Dipper opens the envelope and reads it. And the show lets you sit with the particular ache of a summer ending, not because anything bad happened, not because anyone is in danger anymore, but because something was real, and now it's over, and the space it leaves behind is precisely the shape of what was there. This is what Gravity Falls was always actually about. Not the monsters, though the monsters were wonderful. Not the codes, though the codes were extraordinary. Not even the family drama, though the family drama was the emotional core of everything. All of that was infrastructure for a question that the show never stopped asking from its first episode to its last. What does it mean to grow up? What do you lose when childhood ends? And is what you gain worth the cost? The answer Gravity Falls gives is careful and honest and refuses to be easy. What you lose is real. The show acknowledges this directly. Through Mabel's arc more than anywhere else, her terror of the future isn't portrayed as childish or irrational. It's treated as a genuine grief, the grief of someone who can feel a chapter ending and isn't ready. You are allowed to mourn the summer. You are allowed to love the things that are temporary exactly because they're temporary. The transience of Gravity Falls is what makes it precious, and the show knows this. What you gain is also real. The relationships forged in that strange summer, the ones tested by monsters and dimensional demons and family secrets, and the particular pressure of knowing that the time you have is finite, are more solid for having been tested. Dipper comes back to Piedmont knowing more about who he is than he knew when he left. Mabel comes back having made a choice about who she wants to be. They both come back knowing that their bond is something that can survive actual stakes, actual difficulty, actual distance. The show also gave something to the generation that grew up watching it. And that something is hard to articulate precisely, but worth trying. Ford's story taught a generation of children what intellectual manipulation looks like before they encountered it in the real world. Bill's flattery, his insistence that Ford was special and uniquely chosen, his framing of their partnership as reciprocal and intellectually elevated when it was actually exploitation. These are patterns that exist in real relationships, in real cults of personality, in real exploitation of ambitious and lonely people by entities who understand exactly how to use someone's hunger for recognition against them. Gravity Falls gave its audience a reference point. It gave them a story with a name on it, so that when they encountered something similar, they might, somewhere in the back of their mind, remember what the Triangle Demon was up to. Stan's story taught them what devotion looks like when it doesn't need to be seen or acknowledged. The 30 years in the basement, the name he gave up, the life he paused in service of something larger than himself. Stan never asked to be praised for what he was doing. He never told anyone. He just did it, year after year, because it was Ford. Because some things you do not, because of what you get back, but because the alternative is unacceptable. That's a kind of love that children's stories rarely show clearly. And Gravity Falls showed it with both hands open. McGuckett's story taught them what happens when you run from pain, long enough not as a lecture or a moral, but as a portrait. The man in the junkyard was once brilliant, was once someone who made the extraordinary mundane by mastery. The memory gun is the most honest metaphor for avoidance that children's entertainment has ever produced. And the recovery partial, imperfect, hard one showed what comes after you stop running, which is not an instant return to who you were, but a slow rebuilding of something new. Pacifica's story taught them that you are not your family's worst impulses. That the bell in your head, the trained response to authority and approval that tells you to shut up and comply, is not you. That breaking with what you were taught can cost you the people who taught it to you, and that this cost is real and painful and sometimes worth it anyway. She opened the gate. She let the people in. The Northwest lost everything because of that choice, in the aftermath. And the show implies that some of this is consequence, and some of it is the universe leveling things out. And Pacifica is okay. She is more than okay. She is the first Northwest in 150 years to be actually free. And then there's the layering of the show itself, the cryptograms, the hidden messages, the Easter eggs, the codes that reward obsessive attention with genuine narrative information. What Gravity Falls was teaching, in the act of asking its audience to look closely, was the habit of looking closely. The practice of seeing more than the surface of things. The understanding that detail matters. That things put there by careful hands have meaning. That the world you see on first glance is rarely the whole of the world. These are not small lessons. These are survival skills for a life lived in a world that also hides things in plain sight. The ciphers changed as the show progressed, getting more complex, requiring more sophisticated tools to decode. The audience was being asked to develop alongside the codes. The show's demand on its viewers escalated in parallel with the story's escalation, so that by season 2 you needed to know Visionaire ciphers, to read the credits messages, just as the characters needed to have grown from the first episode twins, who could barely explain a gnome attack, into the people who could look an interdimensional demon in the eye and not flinch. Alex Hirsch made Gravity Falls in the particular way that people make things when they are trying to say something true. Not just fun, though it was very fun. Not just clever, though it was extraordinarily clever. True. The things that Gravity Falls says about family, about loss, about the particular grief of growing up, and the particular joy of coming back to the things you love. Those things ring true because they were written by someone who understood them. Hirsch ended the show when he wanted to end it, not when the network wanted him to, because the story had a shape and he honored that shape. It was always going to end when the summer ended. Everything else would have been extension for extension's sake, the very arrested development the show spent 40 episodes arguing against. The mystery of Gravity Falls is not, in the end, about the journals, or the portal, or the dream demon, or even the family at the center of it all. The mystery is the one every human being carries. How do you hold the things you love, knowing they won't last? How do you love a summer, or a childhood, or a place, or a version of yourself, knowing that all of it is temporary? How do you walk toward the future when the past was so extraordinary? The show's answer: you go anyway. You make the scrapbook. You write down what happened. You leave a note for the next person who comes along and find the journal in the tree. You go anyway, and you hold on to the fact that the thing you're leaving behind was real, is real, will always have been real, which is the permanence the past offers you, not continuation but existence. It happened. You were there. Whatever comes next, you were there for this. So tonight, wherever you're watching this, in whatever hour it is in your part of the world, in whatever quiet or noisy or sleepy or wide-awake state you found yourself in, this is what Gravity Falls was always telling you. Not through ciphers this time, not through backmasked audio or reversed credits messages or symbols hidden in the background of episodes, just directly, in plain sight. The summer was real. The love was real. The mystery was real. And somewhere in the forest above Gravity Falls, Oregon, a stone triangle is half buried in the undergrowth, and the trees grow over it and around it, and the birds don't land on it. And the people who found it during the cipher hunt shook its hand, because Stan Pines told them to, and Stan Pines, who survived 30 years in a basement and a memory erasure and an interdimensional apocalypse, is out on the open ocean with his brother, looking for anomalies. That's the ending. That's always been the ending, baked into the opening, hiding in the credits. The twins are on the bus. The pine trees are outside the window. The note in Dipper's hand says, "See you next summer." And even though we know the summer is over, even though we know that going back to Piedmont means something irreversible about time and change and the shape of childhood, that note doesn't feel like a lie. It feels like exactly what it is, a promise from people who love you, that the extraordinary things are not done with you yet. If you've made it this far, if you're still here, still listening, still somewhere in the amber and shadow of that Oregon forest, thank you. Genuinely, this community is something worth protecting, and the fact that you came here to spend 3 hours with stories about a family and a small Oregon town and a yellow triangle who is not what he seems tells me everything I need to know about who you are. If you're asleep, good. I hope the dreams are strange and warm and full of pine trees. If you're awake, come back whenever you want to. There are more stories here, and if you haven't already, a like and a subscribe costs you nothing and helps this channel keep going. It's how we make more of this. It's how we keep the lights on in the Mystery Shack. Until next time, reality is an illusion. The universe is a hologram. Sleep well. End of script. Section 21. The Creatures of Gravity Falls. A bestiary of beautiful wrongness. One of the things that makes Gravity Falls so distinctly itself, so unmistakably Gravity Falls and nothing else, is the texture of its supernatural world. The creatures and entities Ford documented in the journals are not generic fantasy monsters. They are specific. They have behaviors, motivations, ecological niches. They exist within a coherent internal logic that makes the strangeness of the town feel earned rather than arbitrary. And they contribute to the show's atmosphere in ways that accumulate over time into something genuinely singular. The gnomes we've already touched on, small, bearded, organized, and possessed of a social structure that is both satirically accurate and thoroughly bizarre. But the gnome attack in the pilot is just the beginning of Ford's catalog. There are the Shapeshifter and the Gremloblin, two creatures from Journal 2 and Journal 3 respectively that represent different kinds of threat. The Shapeshifter, encountered in Season 2 inches a bunker below the Gravity Falls forest, is one of the show's most genuinely frightening villains, precisely because it is not a villain in any conventional sense. It was a research experiment gone wrong, a creature created or enhanced to mimic anything it observed, trapped in a bunker for decades, when Ford realized it had become too dangerous to interact with. When Dipper and Mabel encounter it, it has had years of isolation to develop into something deeply unnerving, and its attempt to escape, by taking Dipper's form, creates one of the show's most psychologically unsettling sequences. The Gremloblin is earlier, smaller, almost comedic, a creature that shows you your worst nightmares when you look into its eyes, which makes it dangerous not because of its physical capabilities, but because of what it triggers in the people around it. Ford's notes describe it with clinical precision, but there's a note in the margins of the journal that reads, "Do not look at its eyes. I've made this mistake once. Do not repeat it." The personal stakes in that margin note are characteristic of the journals. The data exists within the context of someone who encountered this thing and survived it, and that someone's survival tips are as important as the taxonomy. The Summerween trickster, who appears in one of the show's most unsettling episodes despite that episode being ostensibly a Halloween parody, is a creature made entirely from discarded candy, a being that formed itself from the accumulated rejection of all the Halloween candy that children had thrown away over years and decades, animated by its hatred of being deemed unworthy. The episode treats this as comedy, up until the moment it doesn't, and the moment it doesn't is the moment where the trickster starts to feel like something from genuine mythology, about waste and grief, and the things we discard that don't stay discarded. The zombie horde in Scary Oak represents a different kind of threat, the threat of the familiar made wrong. Zombies in popular culture are so ubiquitous as to have become almost comfortable, but the show's handling of them emphasizes the specific horror of watching someone you recognize behave as something other than themselves. Stan, in Scary Oak, ends up fighting off a zombie horde during what was supposed to be a party, and the moment is funny and also slightly terrible in exactly the show's characteristic ratio. The time anomaly entity's Time Baby, the enormous baby who appears to be some kind of temporal authority, and Blendin Blandin, the time-traveling agent who encounters the twins across multiple episodes, represent a different category entirely. The administrative supernatural, the bureaucracy of the impossible, the idea that even across dimensions and timelines there are entities whose job is essentially paperwork. It's a peculiarly modern form of cosmic horror, the horror of realizing that even the mechanisms of reality are subject to management and oversight, and that the entities responsible for that management are not necessarily more impressive or competent than the people managing anything else. And then there are the Manitars, half man, half minotaur, entirely obsessed with the performance of masculinity in ways that the show skewers with genuine affection and precision. An episode that could have been a simple Dipper learns to be himself story becomes something sharper because the Manitars are portrayed with enough specificity that their critique lands. The episode teaches its audience something about the difference between strength and the performance of strength, without ever becoming a lecture about it. The creatures of Gravity Falls accumulate into a portrait of a place that is genuinely, comprehensively strange, not arbitrarily strange, but strange in ways that cohere, strange in ways that suggest an underlying ecology of the unusual that Ford was trying to map, and never quite finished mapping. The journal was never complete. Some things in Gravity Falls were never documented. And that's appropriate, because part of the show's atmosphere is the sense of a world larger than what we've seen, of a mythology that extends beyond the edges of the frame. The crashed UFO beneath the valley, mentioned in the context of the hanging cliffs and the weirdness magnetism, is one example of the unexamined depths. Ford speculates but doesn't confirm the ship's origin, the nature of the beings who piloted it, their relationship to the anomalies. Whether anyone or anything from that craft survived the crash in some form, none of this is answered. The UFO is a door that the show opens slightly and then leaves ajar, an invitation to continue wondering. That's intentional. Gravity Falls is not a show that answers everything. It answers the questions that matter to the story. It's telling the questions about family and sacrifice and growing up and the nature of the relationships at its center, and it leaves the purely cosmological mysteries in a productive state of incompleteness. Because the show is not ultimately about the mysteries. The mysteries are the texture of the world. The people are the point. Section 22. Suze and Wendy, the unsung hearts of the Mystery Shack. It would be a failure of attention to talk about Gravity Falls for 3 hours without giving proper time to the two people who hold the Mystery Shack together when everything else is falling apart. Jesus Alzamirano Ramirez Seuss has been the Shack's handyman since he was 12 years old, hired by Stan in a moment that Stan has probably never been fully honest with himself about. Stan hired Seuss because he needed the help. But Stan kept Seuss around for 30 years because Seuss was, in some fundamental way, the person the Shack needed to be what it was. Not just in the mechanical sense, though Seuss's ability to fix things extended well beyond the plumbing and the exhibits. In the human sense, the Shack needed someone who genuinely found joy in it, and Seuss genuinely found joy in almost everything. Seuss is 22 during the summer of 2012. He has spent a decade working at the Mystery Shack, knows every secret corner of the building, and has cultivated a relationship with Stan that is less employee-employer and more something that neither of them has quite named, but that functions very much like family. When Stan berated a customer, Seuss found a way to soften the interaction. When the Shack's exhibits needed to be more convincing, Seuss found a way to make them more convincing. When the twins arrived and needed someone in their corner who was closer to their age and temperament than Stan, Seuss was there. His backstory, the absent father who sent birthday cards, surfaces across the series in small, affecting ways before becoming the subject of Seuss and the Real Girl. An episode about a dating sim game that develops sentience and falls in love with Seuss with a particular intensity that the show finds both funny, genuinely touching. The episode is ostensibly about virtual reality and artificial love, but what it's actually about is someone who grew up without a father's presence, learning what it means to be chosen. The horror subplot of the dating sim AI is real horror, the possessive love that turns controlling, the synthetic relationship that becomes a trap, but it exists alongside genuine pathos, the portrait of a very good and very lonely person trying to figure out who he is. Seuss gets the best ending in the show, which is characteristic of how Gravity Falls rewards goodness. He ends up managing the Mystery Shack. He ends up with a girlfriend named Melody, who appeared briefly and memorably in the same episode as the dating sim. Stan named him the heir to the Shack when Stan and Ford left for the ocean, which means Seuss got exactly what he deserved. The place that was already home became officially his. He also gets to fix up his relationship with Stan in ways that the show handles with quiet emotional intelligence. Stan is not a natural nurturer, does not easily express the things he feels. But his regard for Seuss runs deep and shows in indirect ways the way he trusts Seuss with the practical running of the Shack. The way he occasionally lets his guard down around him in ways he doesn't with most people. When the twins leave at the end of summer, Seuss is among those who sees them off. And his goodbye is characteristically warm and slightly heartbreaking because it is entirely genuine and entirely Seuss. Wendy Corduroy is different. Where Seuss is open-hearted and enthusiastic, Wendy is cool and guarded in the particular way of teenagers who have figured out that guarding yourself is less painful than getting hurt. She is 16, works the register at the Shack with the energy of someone doing the minimum necessary to avoid being fired, and has a social life that seems rich and easy and genuinely fun. But there is a version of Wendy that the show reveals over time, the kid who grew up in a corduroy family that resolves all conflicts physically, in a house full of brothers and a father who treats injury as comedy. A kid for whom the easy surface she presents to the world has been carefully maintained over years of practice. Wendy and Dipper's dynamic is one of the show's most carefully handled relationships, in large part because the show refuses to resolve it in the direction Dipper initially wants. He has a crush on her, a real one, genuine and slightly painful, the kind that 12-year-olds carry like stones in their pockets. And the show honors that crush while also being honest about what it is. A longing for someone older and cooler who has her life together in ways he doesn't, which is almost certainly not what will make him happy in the long run. The moment in Into the Bunker, where Dipper tries to tell Wendy how he feels, and she gently preempts him and reveals that she already knows, is one of the show's most graceful scenes. She is kind about it. She doesn't make him feel foolish for feeling what he feels. She just tells him the truth that she likes him, that she wants to be his friend, that this is the version of things that will actually make them both happy. even if it doesn't feel that way right now. And then she proceeds to prove her point over the rest of the series by being exactly the friend he needed her to be. By the finale, the note she gives him, the one with signatures from everyone, the "see you next summer," is the gesture of someone who has invested genuinely in this kid's well-being and wants him to know that the summer mattered. That he mattered. That the thing between them was real even if it wasn't what he first hoped for. "See you next summer" might be the most emotionally dense 5 words in the show's entire run. Section 23. Gideon Gleeful. The small villain with a large shadow. There is a boy in Gravity Falls named Gideon, who is 9 years old, possibly, and runs the tent of telepathy, definitely, and who has styled himself as a supernatural medium, an audience draw for the rural Oregon supernatural tourism market. He is somehow simultaneously adorable and genuinely terrifying. Gideon Gleeful is Gravity Falls' local celebrity child prodigy. A velvet-suited, pompadoured, entirely bizarre little person who has parlayed possession of Journal 2 into a genuine business. The Tent of Telepathy operates as a tourist attraction in direct competition with Stan's Mystery Shack. And Gideon has the audience numbers to make Stan's jealousy understandable. He is, by the end of his first episode, also revealed to be a villain, not the kind of villain who wrings his hands and announces his evil plans, but the kind who is genuinely convinced that his feelings entitle him to take whatever he wants, who has been raised in an environment that confirmed this entitlement at every turn. His obsession with Mabel, which he frames to himself as love, and which the show frames accurately as possessiveness, as the confusion of love, with ownership that happens when nobody has ever properly told you no, drives his Season 1 arc. He wants Mabel. Mabel does not want Gideon. These are simple facts that Gideon refuses to accept, and his refusal escalates, through multiple confrontations, into him attempting to acquire the Mystery Shack, summoning Bill Cipher, and eventually being arrested at the end of Season 1 inch, a sequence that is simultaneously triumphant and slightly heartbreaking. The slightly heartbreaking part is that Gideon is a child, a genuinely deluded, genuinely dangerous child, but a child. His father, Bud Gleeful, is a member of the Blind Eye Society, which adds a layer to Gideon's formation as a person. He grew up in a household where secrets were kept and difficult truths were suppressed, where the supernatural was acknowledged but never integrated into a coherent worldview. His possession of Journal 2 gave him power before he had the maturity to use it well, and the results are predictable. What's interesting about Gideon's arc in Season 2 is what happens after his arrest. He goes to Gravity Falls Maximum Security Prison, a facility that turns out to be populated by the kinds of people who would end up in a Gravity Falls prison, which is to say, people who have committed crimes in a town where the supernatural is real. He adapts, he finds his footing. He becomes a small-scale power inside the prison, which is absolutely characteristic of Gideon, who will find the available hierarchy in any room and work his way toward its top. When Weirdmageddon begins and the prison is damaged, Gideon escapes. And in the chaos of the supernatural apocalypse, something shifts. Dipper's speech to him about love and coercion, the honest, direct observation that you cannot make someone love you, that loving someone means wanting what's best for them, even when that means accepting rejection, reaches Gideon in a way that all the previous consequences hadn't. Maybe it's the context. A 12-year-old telling you something true during the literal end of the world lands differently than the same statement made in a courtroom or a prison cell. Whatever the reason, Gideon hears it. He lets Dipper and the others go. He chooses, for the first time, to let Mabel be what she actually is, rather than what he wants her to be. He ends up as one of the people in the Zodiac Circle, the One-Eyed Star. He stands next to Robbie Valentino, the Bleeding Heart, in the Wheel of 10 that nearly defeats Bill. He goes to the birthday party at the end. He seems, at the finale, to be in the early stages of actually growing up. That's Gravity Falls' mercy, extended to even its villains. Not erasure of what they did, not forgiveness of harm, but the possibility, always just the possibility, of becoming someone different. Section 24. The physics of grief. What Gravity Falls does with loss. There is a particular kind of grief that Gravity Falls understands better than most children's media, and it's worth naming directly. The grief of time passing, of things ending that you wanted to continue. The show is saturated with characters who cannot let go of the past. The lumberjack ghost who waited 150 years to collect a debt. McGucket who erased himself trying to forget. Stan who froze his entire life around a single moment, his brother's disappearance, and couldn't move until that moment was resolved. Ford, who spent 30 years in other dimensions holding on to the original purpose of his research, even when the context of that research had transformed around him. Every major character in Gravity Falls is, in some way, stuck. And the show's movement, the arc beneath all the adventure and comedy, is the arc of becoming unstuck. The physics of grief in Gravity Falls. Pain persists until it is addressed. Not until it is erased. McGucket tried erasure, and it destroyed him. But until it is faced, acknowledged, and processed in some way that allows it to take its proper place in the past, rather than continuing to define the present. Stan's grief was 30 years of not saying, "I am sorry." Not to anyone who could hear it, Ford was gone, but to himself, in the basement, in the admission that the accident happened and was his fault and could not be undone. The 30 years of work in the basement were, in one reading, a form of penance that he never allowed himself to complete, because completion would require admitting that Ford had been taken somewhere Stan couldn't reach and might never be reached. Ford's grief was the loss of the intellectual confidence that defined him. The realization that the greatest achievement of his career, the portal, the research, the journals, had been a tool in someone else's plan, that his brilliant mind had been used against its own interests, that Bill's entire relationship with him was a con. The show doesn't give Ford an easy redemption from this realization. He comes back from the portal with his arrogance largely intact and has to learn, slowly and painfully, that the cost of trusting only yourself is exactly what it cost him. 30 years alone, in other dimensions, with no one around to catch you when you fall. Mabel's grief in the finale, the grief that makes her vulnerable to Bill's manipulation, is anticipatory grief, the specific anguish of mourning something that hasn't ended yet. She is grieving the summer before it's over. She is grieving her childhood before it's completed, and in the fear of that loss, she makes a choice that accelerates the ending she was trying to prevent. The show is honest about all of this in ways that never condescend. It treats children's grief as real grief. It treats children's fear as real fear. And it trusts its audience to feel the weight of these things without being shielded from them. The resolution it offers is not the absence of loss. Stan loses his memories and gets them back. But the process of losing them was real, and the recovery was not complete. And there are gaps. The summer ends, and the endings of summers are real endings. Ford's 30 years in other dimensions cannot be returned to him. McGucket's 30 years of lost memories, even partially restored, have left permanent marks. What the resolution offers is the knowledge that things were real, that they happened, that the people who loved each other did love each other, and that this is permanent in the way that only the past is permanent, unchangeable, untouchable, solidly existing in a state that nothing can revise. That's the show's answer to grief. The past is the only thing that cannot be taken from you. Whatever happens next, this happened. And if you were there for something worth loving, you will always have been there. It's a children's show. It told children this truth quiet and direct and without apology. And the children who heard it carried it forward.